Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Swamp Shadow from Louisiana. I've lived in Louisiana my whole life. The heat, the thick air, the sound of cicadas that never stop, it's home. There's something about this place that draws people in, but also pushes them away. The swamp, in particular, holds a strange power. It's not something you talk about, but everyone who's been around long enough knows that the swamp has a way of keeping its secrets. My family's farm sits on the edge of it. I've spent years working the land, the rice fields stretching out behind our house, the water always close enough to feel its weight. The house itself is old, passed down through generations, a creaking relic with its sagging porches and windows that let in the humidity, no matter how tightly we shut them. It's quiet here, and I've always liked it that way. No bustling city streets, no noise except for the occasional truck rumbling down the dirt road. It's peaceful, but in the back of my mind, I've always known that the swamp isn't quite as peaceful. Every now and then, a fisherman or a traveler would come through, and they'd tell stories about the creatures that lurk in the water. Most of it, I thought, was just stories. You can't live in a place like this and not get used to the odd sounds at night, the way the shadows seem to move across the water. The swamp has its own rhythm, a kind of pulse that makes you feel small and insignificant when you're near it. I've never been afraid of it, though. I just learned to respect it. But there's something about the silence here now. It's heavier than usual. It's like the air has thickened overnight, pressing in from all sides. The swamps are still, but I can feel something in the air, a strange pull, a feeling that's hard to explain. Maybe it's just the heat. Maybe it's just me. But I can't shake the feeling that the swamp is calling to me. And I'm not sure I want to answer. That evening, the air hung heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something sharp, almost metallic, that I couldn't quite place. I was on the porch, wiping down the tools I'd used in the fields, when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustle, like branches shifting in the breeze. But the wind wasn't blowing. I paused, my hand resting on the old shovel, listening. It came again. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the muck. It wasn't quite like the noise an animal makes when it moves through the underbrush, too deliberate, too consistent. I leaned over the railing, staring into the darkness where the swamp met the horizon. The shadows of the cypress trees stretched long under the low, dimming light of the setting sun. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the sound vibrating in my chest. I shook my head, dismissing it. It was probably a gator dragging itself along the bank, or maybe just an old branch breaking under its own weight. Nothing to be concerned about. The swamp was full of odd sounds at night, and my ears were just picking up on something that was probably normal. But the noise persisted. A slow scrape. Pause. Then, another drag, followed by a heavy thud, like something large landing in the water. It was just off. Too rhythmic. Too precise. I grabbed my mug of coffee, trying to distract myself, but it was impossible. The noise had settled in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I tried to rationalize it. An animal. Maybe a deer or a wild boar foraging along the water's edge. There was nothing to fear. Nothing that should make me feel like something was lurking just out of sight. But when the sound came again, a sharp crack, like a tree limb snapping, I stood up straight, my heart thudding a little louder than usual. I glanced over my shoulder at the dim light from the house, feeling the weight of the swamp behind me, just beyond the reach of my vision. It was nothing. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't help but feel like the sound was waiting for me to turn around, like it wanted me to hear it. And then, there was silence. Total silence. For a moment, I didn't know what to do with the emptiness that followed. The noise had stopped, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had just watched me, something unseen, just out of reach. I took another sip of my coffee and turned back toward the house, deciding it was best to go inside. Maybe I needed some sleep. Maybe I needed to stop letting the swamp get to me. But as I walked back toward the door, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of something cold at the back of my neck. Something that felt like a warning. The next day was hot, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel sluggish. I spent most of the morning in the fields, my shirt soaked through with sweat, my thoughts as heavy as the air. The noise from the night before still lingered in my mind, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the swamp doing what it does best, stirring up the kind of sounds you never really notice until you're paying attention. By midday, I decided to take a break. The fields could wait. I needed a moment of peace, so I made my way toward the water's edge, the familiar path leading me through the thick brush. The swamp was quiet today, too quiet, almost, but I didn't pay much mind. I knelt by the bank, dipping my hands into the cool, dark water, letting the slow current move between my fingers. The water in the swamp is never clear. It's murky, filled with the decay of leaves and the dark roots of cypress trees that stretch down into the earth. But today, something about the surface caught my eye. There was a shift in the water, a brief ripple, almost too smooth, like something had moved just beneath it. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There, just under the surface, something large seemed to shift, like a shadow moving against the flow of the water. For a split second, it looked like a figure, a long, dark shape that seemed to crawl, or slither, through the depths. It didn't make sense. The shadow was too distinct, too solid to be just a trick of the light. But in the next instant, it was gone, disappearing back into the murk as though it had never been there at all. I blinked, my heart quickening for a moment, but I quickly dismissed it. Probably just a log, or a gator slipping through. Nothing more. The swamp has a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when you're staring into that endless, shifting darkness. I stood up, wiping my hands on my pants, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the heat was messing with my head. I hadn't slept well in days, and the weight of the swamp always feels heavier after a long day of work. I looked out over the water one more time, but there was nothing. No ripples, no shape, no sign of what I thought I'd seen. Only the slow, steady motion of the water against the shore. I turned away, taking a deep breath. There was nothing to worry about. Nothing that wasn't just part of the swamp's normal rhythm. But as I walked back toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Something in the water. Something that shouldn't have been there. The heat had finally let up by nightfall, but the air still felt thick, clinging to my skin. I tried to shake the unease that had followed me all day, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, the noise from the night before crept back into my mind, soft, dragging sounds, distant but unmistakable. The memory of the shadow in the water loomed just beneath the surface of my thoughts, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I finally drifted off, the sounds of the swamp outside the window blending with the quiet pulse of my breathing. But the moment my eyes closed, everything shifted. I found myself standing in the swamp, the water up to my ankles, thick and black, swirling around my feet like it was alive. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the trees. The air was damp, thick with the smell of decay and mud, and the only sound was the quiet lapping of water against the shore. I turned, my heart racing for no reason I could understand. That's when I saw it. A shadow, long and dark, stretched out across the water. It moved slowly, purposefully, like it was searching for something or someone. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, and then it slid toward me, as if it had known I was there all along. Its edges were blurred, indistinct, but there was something about it, something that made my chest tighten with fear. I tried to move, but my legs were stuck, as though the water had grown thick and heavy around me. I couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe, as the shadow inched closer, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was a figure, a tall, dark presence, featureless but undeniably there. I could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, as though it could see right through me. I struggled to pull my feet free, but the water wouldn't let go. It was as though the swamp itself was holding me in place, keeping me trapped in this nightmare. The shadow reached out a long, shadowy hand, and I could feel the cold, wet fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me toward the water. Then, just as suddenly, the dream shattered. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, the sheets twisted around my legs as I gasped for breath. The room was dark, silent, the only sound the rustle of the fan above me. I sat up, wiping the sweat from my forehead, my mind still caught in the remnants of the nightmare. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see the swamp outside, shrouded in darkness. But everything was still, just like it always was. The sounds of the night had returned to their normal rhythm. It was just a dream. A stupid, unsettling dream. I stood up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fear. The swamp had always been a part of my life, and I never let it get to me before. It was just stress, that's all. The heat, the long hours, the weight of the work, it had all caught up with me. I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, forcing myself to breathe deeply, to let go of the grip the dream still had on me. But even as I stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, I couldn't help but feel like something had shifted. Like the swamp had just gotten a little bit closer. I shook my head, dismissing it. It was nothing. Just a dream. But the next time I went outside, I couldn't help but glance toward the water, where the shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. The days bled together, the heat still pressing down on everything, making it impossible to escape the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the dream, the eerie sensation that something in the swamp had noticed me, and it lingered in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. I told myself to ignore it, to go about my work as usual, but something kept pulling me back to the water, like an invisible thread, tugging at my thoughts. It was early in the afternoon when I found myself standing at the edge of the swamp again. The sun hung high in the sky, casting everything in a golden light that only made the shadows under the trees darker. The water was still, as usual, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I hadn't meant to come back. But the pull was there, a quiet, insistent voice that seemed to whisper from the depths of the water. I had to know. Had to see for myself. The air felt different this time. It wasn't just the humidity or the stagnant scent of the swamp. There was something more, something thick and heavy that pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe. Still, I stepped forward, my boots sinking slightly into the soft mud as I moved closer to the water. I crouched down by the shore, looking at the ripples that disturbed the surface, tracing their path until they disappeared into the shadows beneath the trees. It was then that I saw something strange. At first, it looked like an old, waterlogged piece of clothing caught on the low branches of a cypress tree. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't just any piece of cloth, it was a jacket. A jacket I recognized. I felt my stomach tighten. The jacket was faded, worn from age, but I knew it immediately. It had belonged to David Miller, a local fisherman who'd gone missing 3 months ago. No one had ever found any trace of him, not even a hint of where he might have disappeared to. His boat had been found abandoned on the edge of the swamp, his gear left behind, but David himself was never seen again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the jacket, my heart hammering in my chest. It was as if the swamp had swallowed him whole, leaving only this reminder behind. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious marks in the mud. Just the jacket, wet and stained, hanging loosely on the branch like it had been carelessly tossed there. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing against the fabric. The water around the swamp was always murky, but the fabric of the jacket felt eerily cold. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the swamp itself had claimed it, leaving a chill behind, a reminder of the things it took. A loud splash echoed from the other side of the water, breaking the stillness, and I jerked back, my heart leaping into my throat. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the dark, silent water and the trees that loomed over me like silent sentinels. I turned back to the jacket, but now the unease in my chest had grown. The feeling that something was wrong, something far deeper than just a missing person, was starting to settle in my bones. I wanted to leave. I should leave. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, from the spot where the jacket had been left. It felt like the swamp was telling me something, something I wasn't ready to understand. I backed away slowly, my steps hesitant, but my gaze never left the water. Whatever had happened to David, whatever had taken him, it was still here. And it was waiting. As I turned to leave, I heard the same dragging sound from the night before. Low, deliberate, coming from the water, almost like someone was moving beneath the surface. My heart raced as I quickened my steps, but the noise seemed to follow me, stretching across the water like a shadow. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The days after I found David's jacket passed by a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about it, the way the water had held it, as if it had claimed it for its own, the coldness of the fabric that seemed to hum with a strange energy. The dragging noise from the night before replayed in my mind over and over, that eerie sensation of being watched. But with each passing hour, the logical part of my mind began to chip away at the fear, telling me it was just coincidence. I had to be imagining things. Still, the more I tried to push it down, the more the doubts crept up. The world outside seemed to continue as normal, people walking through the streets, the sounds of traffic, and the familiar hum of life. But inside me, something had changed. The swamp, the dream, the shadow, it all felt like too much. I spent hours by myself, staring into the murky depths of the water near my house, trying to make sense of everything. But the more I thought about it, the less real it seemed. It didn't help that no one in town seemed to talk about David anymore. His disappearance was quickly fading from the conversation, like some tragedy that was easier to ignore than confront. I needed answers. I had to know if I was losing my mind, or if something truly sinister was happening. The next day, I went into town, hoping to talk to someone who might know more about the swamp, about the missing people, about anything that could explain the strange happenings. My first stop was the old diner, the one with the peeling paint and the rickety sign that always seemed to be one gust of wind away from falling off. The place was full of locals, fishermen, farmers, and a handful of regulars, their voices low and filled with the hum of the town's usual rhythm. I slid into a booth at the back, ordering a coffee and trying to seem casual as I looked around. There was no shortage of stories in Louisiana, especially when it came to the swamp. People loved to talk, especially when it was about something as strange as a missing person or a bad omen. Surely, someone here would know more. At first, it was easy enough to strike up a conversation with the waitress. She was older, weathered by years of the swamp's humidity, but she had a kind smile that made it easy to feel comfortable. "So, you know anything about the swamp?" I asked, leaning on the table. "Anything unusual happening out there?" She paused, her hand stilling as she poured the coffee into my mug. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I caught the slight narrowing of her eyes. "You'll find what you're looking for, all right," she said slowly, placing the coffee down with a little too much force. "But it ain't always the kind of thing you want to find." I nodded, not sure what she meant, but hoping she would elaborate. She didn't. I pushed a little more. "What happened to David Miller? Have you heard anything new about him?" Her face tightened, and she wiped her hands on a dish towel, avoiding my gaze. "Folks here don't talk much about things that don't have an answer," she said, her voice low. "Some things are better left alone, child." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something in the way she spoke, something careful, deliberate. Like she was hiding something. I pressed on. "What do you mean by that? Don't people want to know what happened to him?" She sighed, her expression darkening. "People around here, we know better than to go poking around in places where we don't belong. The swamp, it's got a way of taking things, people included. And it don't give 'em back. You can try and go looking for answers, but sometimes it's best to leave well enough alone." I opened my mouth to ask more, but she was already moving away, her focus shifting to another table, her smile returning as if nothing had happened. I felt unsettled as I sat there, the weight of her words pressing on me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the way she was, superstitious, maybe, or just tired of the same old questions. But something in her tone stuck with me. It was as if she knew something she wasn't willing to say. I spent the rest of the day talking to a few other people, but the responses were always the same: avoidance, vague answers, and a reluctance to speak about the swamp or the disappearances that had happened over the years. The town seemed to know something I didn't, and the more I probed, the more I realized they weren't just being tight-lipped, they were scared. By evening, I was walking back to my truck, feeling like I was on the edge of something, but with no clear path forward. The entire town had shut down any questions I asked about the swamp, as though it was a forbidden topic. The weight of it all settled on my chest, and I wondered, was I really going mad, or was there something else happening here? I glanced back at the swamp in the distance, its outline dark against the setting sun. The shadows seemed deeper now, stretching long across the water, as if calling to me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Something was waiting, and I had to know what. The following morning, the air was thick with mist, as if the swamp itself was trying to hold on to its secrets, keeping them hidden in its dense fog. The town was still quiet, the usual hum of life muted beneath the low growl of distant thunder, signaling a storm on the horizon. It was the kind of day that made everything feel just a little off, like the world was holding its breath. I had to find answers. As I drove past the edge of town, I spotted an old man sitting on his porch, his hunched form casting a long shadow in the early light. He was a figure that seemed almost woven into the landscape, a permanent fixture. I'd seen him many times before, old Henry. He was known around here for his stories about the swamp. They said he'd lived there most of his life, right on the edge of the water, and he'd seen things, or so he claimed. People avoided him, mostly. They considered him strange, a relic of a bygone time, but I was desperate. If anyone could give me answers, it would be him. I pulled up to his small house, the weathered wood of the cabin blending into the overgrown vegetation that surrounded it. Henry's eyes were already on me as I approached, his gaze steady but unreadable. His face was lined with years of sun and hardship, and his clothes were simple, dirty jeans, a faded shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded his eyes from the sun. "You got questions, boy?" His voice was rough, like gravel grinding against stone, but there was an edge of something ancient in it, like he was aware of things that shouldn't be known. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to start. "I've been hearing strange things about the swamp," I began. "I found something recently, a jacket, and it belonged to a man who went missing. People don't talk about it much. What do you know about all that?" Henry's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. He didn't speak for a long time, just rocked in his chair, eyes fixed on me, his hands resting on the cane he'd fashioned from a long piece of driftwood. "You know, the swamp's not a place for folks like you," he said at last, his voice low. "It takes what it wants, when it wants. That's how it is. It always has been." I frowned, my skepticism pushing through. "You're talking about a curse, aren't you?" Henry's smile deepened, but it wasn't one of amusement, it was something older, more worn. "Call it what you like, boy. Curse, old magic, whatever makes sense to you. But the swamp's got its own rules. And they ain't the same as the ones folks like you and me follow." He paused, leaning forward, his voice dropping lower. "You think you're the first one to go poking around, asking questions? No. That swamp's been here long before we ever showed up, and it don't forget who comes calling." I shifted uncomfortably, but I couldn't help myself. "But how does it work? What happens to people? Where do they go?" Henry's eyes glinted with something almost like pity, though I wasn't sure if it was for me or for the situation itself. "People think it's just the swamp, that it's just the water and the mud, the trees and the creatures. But no, son, there's more to it than that. The swamp's got a way of keeping things. People, animals, memories. It takes what it needs and leaves what it doesn't." I tried to push aside the chill creeping up my spine, trying to hold on to my rationality. "You're saying that the swamp steals people?" He nodded slowly, the motion deliberate. "Not steal, no. It doesn't take him away, not in the way you might think. It's more like it absorbs them, pulls them into itself, makes him part of the swamp. You can hear him if you listen close enough, those who've gone under. Their voices, their cries." I shook my head, trying to fight off the weight of his words. "That doesn't make sense. You're telling me that the swamp has some kind of supernatural power?" Henry gave a sharp, almost bark-like laugh. "Supernatural? Maybe. But it's been here longer than any of us, boy. Ain't no supernatural. It's just the way things are. He paused, his expression turning more serious, his voice quieter now, as if he was sharing something he rarely spoke of. The swamp, don't forget. Not for long. Those who get taken, they're never truly gone. They stay in the water, in the shadows. Watching. I looked away, trying to push the unsettling thought from my mind. It was absurd. The swamp was just a swamp. There was nothing special about it. Just mud, trees, and water. But as Henry's words lingered in the air, I found it harder to convince myself. The water, the way it seemed to shift even when there was no wind, the shadow I had seen, could it really be something more? Is there any way to stop it? I asked, my voice hesitant. Henry's gaze softened, and he gave a slow shake of his head. You can't stop what you can't see coming, son. The swamp takes its toll. All you can do is stay away. Let it be. I stood there, trying to process everything he had said. It felt like a part of me was torn between disbelief and something else, a growing fear that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. The idea of a curse, of something ancient and unfathomable living in the swamp. It was enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, forcing a casual tone into my voice. Well, thanks for the advice, Henry. I'll, keep that in mind. He simply nodded, his eyes never leaving mine, as if he knew something I didn't, or perhaps something I wasn't ready to know. As I turned to leave, his voice called after me, low and soft. Be careful out there, boy. The swamp's always watching. And it don't forget those who come calling. I didn't answer. I just walked back to my truck, the weight of his words heavy in my mind. And the further I drove away from his cabin, the more I felt like the shadows in the swamp were creeping closer. It started slow, like a whisper carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the swamp settling in for the night, the creak of old trees, the murmur of water lapping against the shore, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the days wore on, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was as if something was moving out there, something with purpose. At night, when the world seemed to fall into a deep, suffocating silence, I'd hear it, distant at first. A soft shuffle, like the slow drag of boots through mud. I'd sit up, straining to listen, my heart thudding in my chest. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. Was it in the swamp? Was it outside my window? But then it would stop. The stillness would return, broken only by the chirping of distant insects. It was nothing, I kept telling myself. It was just the swamp, settling in for the night, like it always did. Nothing more. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself from the growing unease that seemed to wrap around me like a thick fog. The rain had started to fall in heavy sheets, slashing against the windows with an angry force. I was reading, something light to keep my mind off the swamp, and the light from the lamp beside me cast long, flickering shadows across the room. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle. Like footsteps. I froze, the book slipping from my hands as I held my breath. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old wood, old beams. But no. It came again. A slow, deliberate step. Closer. I stood up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. I moved cautiously to the window, peering through the blinds, but all I saw was the rain. The dark silhouette of the swamp loomed beyond the tree line, its waters undisturbed. There was nothing there. just my imagination. But as I stepped away, the footsteps came again, closer, louder. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room, my pulse racing. The house felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. I wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, heavy, slow. And then there was a sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine, a cry. It was distant, but unmistakable. A human cry. It echoed through the house, breaking the silence in a way that left me paralyzed. I wanted to call out, to scream, but I couldn't move. It was as though the sound was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the very floor beneath my feet. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and rushed down the hallway, my breath shallow. The light flickered weakly as I moved, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around me. The footsteps followed, keeping pace with my every step. But when I turned the corner into the living room, there was nothing. The room was empty. The sound of crying had stopped, but the footsteps didn't. They had stopped only for a moment before they began again. This time, they were behind me. I whirled around, shining the light behind me, but again, nothing was there. The house was silent except for the rhythmic thud of my own heart in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt it, a presence. Something unseen, something that followed me, always just out of sight. I rushed to the door, pulling it open, desperate to get outside, but as soon as I stepped out onto the porch, the world felt wrong. The air was thick and heavy, the rain falling in slow, unnatural sheets. The swamp was still, too still. No insects chirped. No birds called out. It was as if everything had gone silent, waiting. I turned back inside, slamming the door behind me. The footsteps continued, now more insistent, louder, almost frantic. I could hear them all around me, around the walls, behind the windows, beneath the floorboards. I stood still, trembling, listening. The cries had returned, closer now, almost as if they were in the room with me, but I could see no one. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall as I slid down to the floor. The cries grew louder, piercing, as if someone, no, something, was begging for help. Please, the cry whispered, barely audible. It was a voice, broken, distorted. The words didn't make sense, and yet, I knew deep down, I knew that it was calling to me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath quickening, my mind racing. Was it real? Or had the swamp finally claimed my sanity? The footsteps stopped. The cries faded into nothing. The house was silent once more, but I knew it wouldn't last. Something had changed. The shadow was closer now, its presence creeping closer to me, seeping into my very home. The swamp was calling, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. The sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long, jagged shadows over the swamp. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy, suffocating. I had gone down to the water's edge, hoping to clear my mind and maybe, just maybe, shake off the creeping sense of dread that had taken root. It had been a week since the footsteps, since the cries. And though the house had remained silent since that night, the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It hung over me like a cloud, dark and oppressive. I was standing by the old pier, staring out at the water, watching the ripples disturb the still surface. There was something soothing about the rhythm of it, like the swamp was trying to lull me back into a false sense of normalcy. But as my gaze swept over the water, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, one of the local fishermen, perhaps, moving along the shore. But the way the figure moved didn't sit right with me. It was too slow, too deliberate, as though they were being pulled toward the water rather than walking of their own accord. My heart began to race, a familiar unease creeping into my chest. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. The figure was too far to recognize, but the closer they got to the water's edge, the more I could see their movements, jerky, almost as if they were struggling against something unseen, something stronger than them. It was like they didn't want to be there, but they couldn't stop themselves. And then it happened. The man, an older local I vaguely recognized from town, stepped too close to the water. He teetered on the edge of the bank, his arms flailing briefly as if he'd lost his balance. I froze, watching him. There was no scream, no shout for help, just the eerie sound of water lapping against the shore. He didn't fall. He didn't stumble. Instead, he seemed to sink. It was as if the swamp had reached up and pulled him in, swallowing him whole. His legs disappeared beneath the murky water in one fluid motion, and his body, stiff and unmoving, seemed to vanish into the depths. The ripples spread out, distorting the water, but there was no splash, no sound of struggle. It was as though the swamp had taken him, without a trace. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my heart thudding in my chest, my breath shallow. What had I just seen? My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but all I could do was stand there, frozen, unable to comprehend what had happened. And then it was gone. The water was still again, the ripples fading as if nothing had ever disturbed it. There was no sign of the man. No trace of his presence remained on the shore, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. But no, I had seen it. I had seen him disappear, vanish right before my eyes. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned and ran back toward the town, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was reeling, spinning in circles as I tried to make sense of what I had witnessed. But there was no logical explanation. I didn't stop running until I reached the diner, where a few locals were gathered. They were chatting idly, not a care in the world, and when I burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed, they all looked up at me with surprise. "You okay, kid?" One of the men, Gus, asked with a raised brow. He was a regular at the diner, his gruff face usually full of life, but today I could see the tiredness in his eyes. It was like he'd been carrying something for a long time, and the weight was starting to show. Did you see?" My voice faltered. I couldn't even finish the sentence. Did anyone see what happened by the water? There was a brief pause, and the room fell silent. I looked around at the faces staring back at me. No one said a word. No one moved. Finally, Gus spoke, but his words were slow, measured, like he was carefully choosing them. "I didn't see anything, boy. Just the usual, just another quiet evening, same as always." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him what I had seen, but something in his eyes made me hesitate. He didn't look like he was lying. He looked like someone who knew better than to ask questions. Someone who had learned, over the years, that it was safer not to acknowledge certain things. "You sure you're all right, son?" he asked again, his tone softer now, almost like a warning. I nodded, though I didn't feel all right. My stomach churned with the weight of what I had just witnessed. The fear was starting to creep back in, cold and relentless. Yeah, I'm fine, I muttered, but I didn't feel fine. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the way he had vanished, swallowed whole by the swamp. The silence of it. The way no one seemed to care. No one seemed to notice that something was wrong. The next day, I heard no mention of the incident. Not a word. Not even a whisper. It was like it had never happened. But I knew it had. And now, something darker was beginning to take hold. People weren't talking about it. And I was beginning to understand why. The swamp was calling, and it was taking more than just the missing. It was taking the truth. The nights had grown darker, more oppressive. The weight of the swamp seemed to press down on me with every passing hour, as if it were closing in, waiting for the right moment. The air was thick, so thick it felt like it was choking me. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I kept thinking about the man, how he had disappeared into the water without a trace. The image haunted me, replaying in my mind with every quiet moment. The feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. The footsteps that had followed me through the house, the cries that had echoed in my ears, they were always with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. That night, I found myself at the water's edge again. I didn't know why I came here. Maybe I was hoping to find some kind of answer, or maybe I just needed to be near it, to face whatever was happening head on. I stood there, staring out over the dark waters, trying to steady my nerves. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the swamp, making the water shimmer with an eerie glow. It was silent, too silent. Even the usual hum of the insects and the calls of distant birds had faded away, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the soft lapping of water against the shore. I heard it then, a soft rustle, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound came again, followed by a ripple in the water. Something was moving beneath the surface. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, trying to make out what was causing the disturbance. The water was too murky to see anything clearly, but I swore I saw something large, something dark, moving beneath the surface. It was like a shadow, a shape that didn't belong in the water, twisting and turning, almost like it was alive. I took a step back, my pulse racing. There, at the very edge of the water, the shadow shifted again. This time, it was closer, close enough that I could see the outline of it, a dark, fluid form that seemed to be rising from the depths. My breath caught in my throat as the shape began to solidify, taking on more distinct form. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else. I could make out the faintest suggestion of a face, a twisted, grotesque visage that seemed to flicker in and out of existence with the movement of the water. The figure was tall, its body long and lean, stretching out like a serpent, yet it moved with an unnatural grace, as though it wasn't bound by the laws of nature. For a moment, I thought I saw its eyes, two glowing orbs that stared back at me from beneath the water. They were hollow, empty, but full of an indescribable hunger, as if they were looking into my soul. My skin crawled. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The water around the figure swirled, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished beneath the surface, leaving only ripples in its wake. I stood there, frozen. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs weak beneath me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened as the cold grip of fear tightened around me. Had it been real? I had to be imagining things. It had to be some trick of the light, some play of shadows on the water. I had been out here too long. My mind was starting to break down from the isolation. The pressure was getting to me. I stumbled backward, shaking my head, trying to clear the image from my mind. But the more I tried to convince myself it hadn't happened, the more vivid it became. The figure, the eyes, it felt so real. I backed away slowly, my eyes still locked on the water, my breath coming in short gasps. The sound of the water was all I could hear now, the quiet lapping of the waves against the shore. But beneath that, I could still hear the whisper of something calling deep within the swamp. I turned and ran, not looking back. The further I got from the water, the more my breathing slowed, but the terror still gripped me. When I reached the safety of the house, I slammed the door behind me, my hands trembling as I locked it. I leaned against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind refused to let go of the image, the eyes, the shadow. I had seen it. I knew I had. But no one would believe me. Everyone in town knew the stories of the swamp, the tales of disappearances, of strange creatures lurking in the murky depths. They all treated it as folklore, something to pass the time. But I had seen it. The shadow. The thing that lived in the water. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that the fatigue and stress had finally caught up with me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The swamp was alive. And it was watching me. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. It was in the water, in the shadows, waiting for its moment to claim me, just as it had claimed so many others. And it was getting closer. The days blurred together in a haze of unease. I couldn't escape it. The feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me, it never left. It followed me into the house, lingered in the corners of my mind during the day, and seeped into my thoughts at night. It wasn't just the fear anymore, it was something physical, something that gnawed at my body and soul. At first, I didn't think much of it. The dizziness was easy to dismiss. The heat of the swamp, the humidity, maybe I had just overexerted myself. But it didn't stop. It wasn't the usual lightheadedness you get from standing up too quickly or from dehydration. This was different. It felt like my head was filled with fog, like the world around me was slowly losing its focus. I woke up one morning with the feeling that the room was spinning, the walls pulsing in and out of view. I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself, nausea rising in my throat as my vision blurred. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. It was as if the swamp had crawled into my bones, filling me with its weight. I staggered outside, gasping for fresh air, but even the breeze couldn't clear the fog in my mind. I tried to shake it off, but the dizziness lingered, like a shadow in the back of my thoughts. The world seemed off, out of sync. Every sound felt muted, like I was hearing it underwater. The leaves rustled, the wind howled, and the water, always the water, made its quiet, insistent lapping sound against the shore. I couldn't tell if it was just the swamp's oppressive atmosphere or if something more sinister was at work. The nightmares began soon after. At first, they were just strange dreams, images that didn't make sense, fleeting moments that left me feeling uneasy when I woke up. But soon, they became more vivid, more intense, until I couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. In the dreams, the swamp was always the same. Dark and suffocating, the water black and swirling with shadows. But the shadows were moving now, not just in the water but in the trees, creeping along the edges of the forest, whispering to me. The same twisted figure from the night by the water appeared in the distance, always just out of reach, always watching. Its eyes, glowing and hollow, followed me wherever I went. And the closer I got to it, the farther it seemed to retreat until I was lost, wandering in the dark. But it wasn't just in the dreams. Every time I woke up, I felt the same sense of dread, the same oppressive weight in the air. The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare that never truly ended. One night, the dream shifted. This time, I was awake, at least, I thought I was. I was standing by the water's edge, just like before, only this time, the air felt colder, the swamp seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The figure was there, closer now, its face twisted in that same horrid, ever-shifting expression. It reached out to me, its hand emerging from the water, long and bony, fingers that seemed to stretch toward me with an inhuman slowness. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My feet were stuck in the mud, my chest tight with fear as I felt the cold touch of its presence creeping over me. I reached out, my hand trembling, desperate to pull away, but it felt like I was being drawn toward it, like the swamp was dragging me under, pulling me into its depths. And just as its fingers brushed my skin, I woke up. But it wasn't over. The feeling of the touch, the cold, clammy sensation, lingered on my skin like it was real. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, disoriented, but everything was still. Everything was as it should be. Except it wasn't. I could still hear it, the faint whisper of the water, the low hum of the swamp, the sound of something moving just beyond my reach. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead, my body heavy and weak. It was as though the swamp had seeped into me, poisoning me from the inside. The dizziness returned, stronger now, and I had to grip the edge of the bed to keep myself from falling. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself, but my mind was still lost in the nightmare, still trapped in the fog that had overtaken my senses. I stumbled to the window, my heart still racing. The swamp was outside, dark and silent under the moonlight, but it felt different now. It felt alive. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, deep down, that something was wrong, something was coming. The air was thick, too thick, and I could feel it closing in around me. Every breath felt shallow, like the swamp was slowly choking the life out of me, one breath at a time. I wanted to leave, to get away from it all, but the thought of going back out there, back into the swamp, terrified me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever had been following me, was waiting for me to step out into the dark again. The shadow was still there, lurking in the water, in the trees, in the very air I breathed. And I couldn't escape it. I sank down to the floor, my back against the wall, and closed my eyes. But even with my eyes shut, I could still see it, the shadow, the eyes, the hand reaching out from the water. The nightmare wasn't just in my dreams anymore. It was here. It was real. The days continued to crawl by, each one feeling like a battle. A battle against the exhaustion that weighed down my body, against the unease that gnawed at my thoughts, and most of all, against the feeling that something, someone, was always just behind me, watching, waiting. At first, it was easy to ignore. The occasional flicker in the corner of my eye, the sense that something was moving just out of view. I told myself it was nothing more than my overactive imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. But as the days passed, those fleeting glimpses began to feel more real. They weren't just tricks, they were signs. Signs that the shadow was closer than I ever could have imagined. I first saw it in the water. I was by the lake again, trying to clear my head, trying to make sense of the chaos in my mind. The water was still, like glass, reflecting the pale light of the moon. But as I stared into its depths, I saw it, just for a moment, like a shadow flickering beneath the surface, moving against the current. I blinked, and it was gone. But it wasn't a trick this time. I knew it wasn't. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing else. No one else. Just me, alone with the still water. Yet, the air felt different, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing against me. The shadow was there, hidden beneath the water, its presence undeniable. It wasn't just a flicker, it was a part of the swamp itself, waiting to rise. I hurried back to the house, trying to shake the feeling of being hunted. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I did. But the feeling of being watched was still there, lurking in every room. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside with me. I couldn't escape it. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing it, soft, distant footsteps, moving just beyond my reach. It was as if something was pacing outside my window, waiting for the right moment to slip inside. But when I finally gathered the courage to get up and look, there was nothing. The yard was empty, the trees standing still against the sky. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching me. Something waiting. The next morning, I made my way to the bathroom, trying to push the lingering dread to the back of my mind. But as I stood before the mirror, brushing my teeth, I saw it again. The shadow. It wasn't in the room with me, not physically, but there it was, just behind my reflection. In the mirror, its shape was clearer, darker, like a blot of ink spilling across the surface. It was watching me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I froze, my toothbrush halfway to my mouth, staring at the reflection of something that shouldn't have been there. It was just a shadow, a distortion in the glass. But I could feel it. I could feel it breathing down my neck. I spun around, heart racing, but once again, the room was empty. I was alone. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that the shadow had appeared in the mirror, or the fact that I had been too terrified to even move, too frozen in place to escape it. My reflection stared back at me, still, unblinking, and I couldn't tear my gaze away. It was like I was waiting for something I couldn't see but knew was there, waiting in the depths. I told myself it was just another trick of my mind, just a consequence of the stress, the isolation, the fear. But that didn't explain the way my reflection had shifted, how the shadow had moved as if it were alive, as if it were an extension of me. It wasn't the mirror's fault. It wasn't the swamp's fault. It was mine. I started to see it everywhere. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. I saw it in the reflection of the glass windows, the way the light shifted just enough to make the shadow flicker, just enough to make me second-guess my own eyes. I saw it in the puddles of water on the ground, in the ripples of the lake. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, just beyond reach. One afternoon, I sat in the living room, trying to focus on a book. But I couldn't concentrate. The shadow was there, in the window, moving in and out of view as the light changed. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep my mind on something, anything else, but it was impossible. I kept glancing up, expecting it to be gone, but it was always there. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, it was still there, waiting. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, and walked over to the window. I reached out, my fingers brushing the glass, hoping to wipe away whatever it was I had seen. But the moment my hand touched the window, the shadow moved. I felt it, deep in my gut, as if the air around me thickened, the space between me and the glass shrinking, the darkness closing in. And then I saw it clearly, as if the shadow was standing right beside me, pressing against the glass. Its shape was familiar, but twisted, long and thin, and the same empty eyes stared back at me from within it. I recoiled, stumbling back from the window, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I stood there, frozen. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow was everywhere now, inside and out, in the mirrors, in the windows, in the reflections of water. And I knew it wasn't just following me anymore. It was inside me too. I ran from the house, desperate to escape it, but even then, I could still feel it watching me, following me, as if it were always one step ahead. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The shadow, the whispers, the haunting presence that followed me everywhere, it was all too much. I had to know what was happening. I needed to understand what was lurking in the swamp and why it had singled me out. The locals didn't speak much about the swamp, and when they did, it was always in hushed tones, as if even the mention of it was dangerous. The more I asked around, the more I realized how little anyone was willing to share. People grew tense, their eyes shifting, their voices lowering when I brought up the topic. Some of them even avoided me after I pressed them for answers. But I couldn't let it go. One afternoon, I went to the local library, hoping to find something, anything, that could shed light on the swamp's dark history. The old building was dusty and quiet, the air heavy with the smell of paper and mildew. I sifted through the rows of books and newspapers, each one feeling more lifeless than the last. But then, I found a collection of old journals, local accounts, and weathered maps that might contain the answers I needed. I leafed through the pages slowly, scanning the faded ink and yellow paper. There were stories, old stories, about the swamp, about the people who had lived and disappeared in its depths. The accounts were vague, fragmented, but there was a pattern to them, a sense of unease that tied them together. One entry described how, many years ago, there had been a group of settlers who tried to build a small community on the edge of the swamp. They thought they could tame the land, take it for themselves. But soon, they began to disappear. One by one, they vanished without a trace. Their homes were found abandoned, doors left ajar, meals half-eaten on the tables. The swamp had taken them, and no one knew how or why. The journal entry mentioned the presence of a shadow in the water, a figure that seemed to stalk the land, dragging people into the depths. The settlers had heard strange noises at night, cries from the water, and glimpses of something moving beneath the surface. No one could explain it, but eventually the remaining settlers left, abandoning the land. They never spoke of what happened, but rumors spread that the swamp had claimed them all. I kept reading, my heart pounding. It was impossible to ignore the similarities between these old accounts and what I had been experiencing. The shadow, the cries, the feeling of being drawn toward the water, everything fit. I found more entries, scattered across the journals. One of them mentioned the disappearance of a local man named Henry Carter, a fisherman who had been well known in the area. He had lived alone near the swamp and was known to venture deep into its waters. One evening, he went out to check his traps but never returned. His boat was found overturned, but there was no sign of him. His family searched for days, but there was no trace. They said they heard his cries, distant and echoing from the water, but when they went to look, there was nothing but silence. Another entry described a woman named Eleanor Pierce, who had lived in a cabin near the edge of the swamp. She was known for her knowledge of herbs and healing, but one evening, she too vanished. The locals had found her cabin undisturbed, her belongings left behind, but there was no sign of struggle. They say her spirit still wanders the swamp, searching for a way out, calling for help that never comes. As I read these accounts, I felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. The stories seemed too familiar, too real. It was as if the swamp had been taking people for generations, claiming them in ways that no one could explain. I closed the book with a shaking hand, my mind reeling from the weight of what I had uncovered. The shadow wasn't a new phenomenon, it had been here for as long as the swamp itself. And it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. It had taken others before me, and now it seemed to be coming for me. I needed answers, but the more I learned, the more questions I had. How long had this been happening? Why had no one ever stopped it? The locals were too afraid to speak, too afraid to face the truth. But I couldn't stop now. I decided to visit the families of the people who had disappeared. Maybe they knew more, maybe they had seen something I hadn't. I didn't expect much. The swamp had a way of keeping its secrets, and the people who had been affected by it seemed to be just as lost and broken as the land itself. I spoke to one man, an old fisherman named Sam, who had known Henry Carter. His hands trembled as he spoke, his eyes clouded with fear. "You don't want to go out there," he warned, his voice low. "The swamp doesn't give back what it takes. It'll claim you just like it claimed Henry. Just like it claimed the rest of them." I tried to press him for more, but he clammed up, his face going pale. It was the same with everyone I spoke to. They had heard the stories, they had felt the terror, but none of them were willing to face it head on. It was as if the swamp had a power over them, a grip that they couldn't escape. As I left the town and walked toward the swamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadow was still out there, waiting for me. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the trees, just beneath the surface of the water. The more I learned, the more I realized that there was no escaping it. It had been here for centuries. And now, it had found me. I had gathered all the facts I could, at least what the townspeople were willing to share, and yet nothing seemed to explain what was happening to me. The more I learned, the more I felt as though I was walking on the edge of something I didn't fully understand, something ancient and insidious. But the fear, the unease that weighed on me, still gnawed at my mind, and nothing made sense. It was on one of my walks through the village that I met her. Her name was Mama Rosa, a woman well into her 80s, with a head of wild, gray hair and a weathered face that seemed older than the town itself. She lived in a small, ramshackle house at the far edge of the village, near the swamp's edge, far from the main road where people would usually pass by. Mama Rosa had lived in the area all her life, and people said she knew more about the swamp than anyone else. I had heard whispers about her over the years. Some said she was a healer, others that she was a mystic, someone who could speak to the spirits of the land. But most of the townsfolk didn't bother with her. They spoke of her in hushed tones, as though she was more legend than reality. I wasn't sure if I believed in any of that, but at this point, I was willing to hear anything. I had to know what was happening. When I knocked on her door, she didn't answer right away. I stood there for a while, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, the trees around her house creaking in the wind. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the swamp, and for a moment, I almost turned back. But then, the door creaked open, and there she was. Mama Rosa's eyes were clouded with age, but they gleamed with a knowing that made my skin prickle. She looked me over slowly, sizing me up, before she spoke. "You've been asking questions," she said, her voice raspy and slow, as though the words had been held in her chest for far too long. Not many people come to me, especially not ones like you. I didn't know what she meant by ones like you, but I wasn't about to argue with her. I nodded and stepped closer. I've been hearing things, I began, my voice faltering. Strange things. I think this swamp is affecting me. She raised a hand, cutting me off. Her grip was strong, her fingers twisted and knotted from years of labor. You feel it, don't you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper now. The pull. The shadow. I froze. What do you mean? How do you know? Mama Rosa stepped back from the door, gesturing for me to come inside. I hesitated for a moment, but I stepped into her home, drawn by something I couldn't explain. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and something else, something metallic, like iron. Her house was cluttered with old trinkets, feathers, candles, and jars filled with unknown contents. A fire crackled in the hearth, and for a moment, I felt the weight of the years settle over me. She motioned for me to sit down across from her, and without waiting for me to speak, she began. The swamp is ancient, she said, her voice low, almost reverent. Older than this village. Older than the people who live here. There is something in the water. Something that doesn't belong. A spirit, they say. It watches. It waits. And it pulls people in. I didn't know what to think. I had heard rumors, sure, but I had dismissed them as nothing more than old folklore, tales spun by the fearful minds of people who didn't understand the swamp. But Mama Rosa spoke with such certainty, such calm, that it sent a chill through me. The shadow, she continued, her eyes narrowing as if seeing something in the distance, is the spirit of the swamp. It lures people in, especially those who are lost, lost in their minds, lost in their hearts. It promises release, freedom, but it only gives them darkness. I tried to keep my composure, to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a woman far too long in the wilderness. You believe in this, swamp spirit? I asked, a little too dismissively. She gave a soft laugh, but there was no joy in it. Believe it or not, child. But it's the truth. The shadow has been here longer than anyone can remember. It knows when someone's spirit is fragile, when they're lonely or troubled. It calls to them, gentle at first, but louder, louder each day until they can't resist. The water is its home. It takes them into the deep, where there is no return. I shook my head, trying to push the words out of my mind. It sounds like folklore, like something made up to scare people away. I've heard the stories, but I don't believe. She cut me off again, her voice sharp and insistent. You should believe. You are already feeling it, aren't you? The pull? The whispers? It's already begun. The swamp doesn't just take anyone. It takes those who are weak, those who wander too far into its reach. I see it in you, child. I see the shadow. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but her words seemed to pierce through me. I didn't want to believe her. I couldn't. This was crazy, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I've seen it, I admitted quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. In the water. In the reflections. And I hear it, footsteps, crying. But it's all just too much. I can't make sense of it. Mama Rosa stared at me, her gaze unwavering. The spirit doesn't need sense. It doesn't care if you believe or not. It takes what it wants. And it won't stop until it has you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I stood up abruptly, feeling a swell of panic rise in my chest. I don't believe this. This is just folklore. You're telling me stories from the past, from things that happened long ago. Mama Rosa didn't move, but her eyes followed me, steady and calm. You will believe soon enough, child. The swamp has already chosen you. I walked out of her house, my mind racing, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to believe her. I couldn't. But as I stepped back into the fading light of the day, I could feel the air around me shift, colder, denser. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was alone. The shadow was out there, waiting. And now, it knew my name. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go back. I needed answers, not the ones Mama Rosa had given me, but my own. She had scared me, no doubt, but it wasn't fear that drove me back to the swamp. It was the undeniable need to face whatever was lurking there. To confront it, whatever it was, and make sense of this madness. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the inky blackness of the night. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of distant croaking frogs and rustling leaves only added to the eerie stillness. The swamp was alive with its usual chorus, but tonight, something felt different. The silence between the sounds seemed heavier, as if the swamp was holding its breath. I had learned that the shadow, whatever it was, couldn't be ignored anymore. It wasn't just in the water. It was in my dreams, in the reflections, in the very air I breathed. It was out there, watching me. And I had to face it, whatever it was. If this was all just some twisted trick of my mind, I needed to prove it to myself. And if not, well, then I needed to understand it. I made my way down the familiar path toward the water's edge. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches creaking in the wind. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the swamp, making the water glisten like black glass. But the further I walked, the more uneasy I became. It felt as if the swamp itself was alive, watching me. I could almost feel its eyes on me, the shadows shifting with every step. The air was thick, damp with moisture, and every footstep I took seemed to echo louder than it should have. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced myself to keep moving. I wasn't turning back. Not now. As I reached the edge of the water, I stood still for a moment, listening. The swamp was eerily quiet now, the usual sounds of wildlife gone. It was as if the world had frozen. And then, I heard it. A faint sound, like a soft whisper. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained my ears, trying to identify the source. It was coming from the water. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The water rippled gently, as though something was moving beneath the surface, something unseen, something that had been waiting for me. I reached for the flashlight, turning it toward the water's edge, my fingers trembling. And then I saw it. A shadow, dark, fluid, almost serpentine, moved just below the surface of the water. It was no longer just a fleeting figure, no longer a trick of the light. It was real. And it was there, watching me. The shadow was the same shape, the same presence I had seen in the reflections. But this time, it wasn't in a mirror or a window. It was in the water, as if it had been waiting for me. I took a step back, the cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow writhed and shifted beneath the water, moving closer to the shore. The faint whispering sound grew louder, almost like a voice, but it was muffled, unintelligible. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I spoke, my throat dry. "Is anyone there?" The water rippled, and for a split second, I saw it, a figure. A man? A woman? It was hard to tell. The shadow was so distorted, so formless, that it was impossible to make out anything more than a vague silhouette. But I could feel its presence, feel the weight of it pressing in on me. It was close, too close. I took another step back, my legs unsteady. And then I heard something else, a rustling sound, coming from the trees behind me. I froze. I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I saw them, figures, moving silently between the trees. At first, I thought they were shadows too, just part of the night, part of the illusion. But no, they were too distinct, too solid. They were people, human shapes moving slowly, almost gliding, their eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. I tried to make sense of it, but the figures didn't make sense. They didn't move like people. They moved like ghosts, like something that didn't belong. They were close now, too close, and the air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. But they didn't answer. They just stared, their eyes empty, like the eyes of the lost. Then, the shadow in the water stirred again. A shape began to rise from the depths, something far larger than I had imagined, something that had been waiting. A face, a distorted visage, appeared in the water's surface, its features twisted and monstrous. It was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. The figures behind me moved closer, and I could feel them closing in, surrounding me, their presence suffocating. The whispering sound rose to a deafening pitch, drawing out everything else. I couldn't breathe. The shadow in the water loomed larger, and I realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't just watching me. It was pulling me in. It had always been pulling me in. With one final, desperate breath, I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it take me. But the figures were faster, closing in with terrifying speed. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and the trees around me blurred into shadow. I heard the whispering, the soft murmur of voices, and I knew they were there. They were coming for me. And then I felt it. Cold, clammy fingers brushed my shoulder. The water. The swamp. It had me. As the darkness swallowed me whole, I realized the truth I had been trying to deny all along. The shadow wasn't something I could fight. It was part of the swamp. It was part of me now, and there was no escaping it. Sleep was a distant memory. I had never realized just how much I had relied on it until it was taken from me, piece by piece, night after night. The shadow, it haunted my every waking moment, and I couldn't escape it. Not in the light, not in the dark. It was always there, lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. It had crept into my mind, and now it had claimed my nights. The first few nights after my encounter by the water were filled with restless tossing and turning. The shadows under my eyelids would shift and twist, taking the shape of dark figures moving through the trees. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, at the edge of the swamp, hearing the whispers, seeing the figures in the dark. But it wasn't just in my dreams. It was in my waking life too. It started small, a flicker in the corner of my vision. At first, I thought it was just the stress, the fear, the lack of sleep playing tricks on me. I would turn quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Just the stillness of my house. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was watching me, waiting for me to look away, to slip up, to let my guard down. Every day, the unease grew. I couldn't focus. I couldn't work. My thoughts kept drifting back to the swamp, to the shadow in the water, and the figures I had seen. No matter how hard I tried to block it out, it consumed me. The feeling that I was being watched never left. At night, the house seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in on me. My flashlight became my only comfort, its beam cutting through the darkness like a fragile lifeline. But it never made me feel safe. I could hear the sounds, footsteps in the hall, whispers outside my door. When I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, I would search the room, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But there was nothing except the silence, thick and suffocating. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. During the day, the world seemed distorted. The sunlight felt harsher, the air thicker. When I walked down the street, I felt eyes on me, strangers watching me from their windows, neighbors glancing over their shoulders as I passed. It was as if the entire town knew something I didn't. The whispers had begun again, but now they weren't just in the swamp. They were in the streets, in the very air I breathed. Sometimes, I would hear a soft voice calling my name, or the sound of something, or someone moving behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. I had become a shell of who I used to be. My mind was slipping, spiraling into fear. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I couldn't trust myself. I tried to tell myself that it was all just paranoia, a trick of my imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. The shadow was real. It wasn't just in the water. It had followed me home. It was inside me now. I couldn't even look into a mirror without feeling like something was there, just behind me, waiting for its moment. Every time I saw a reflection, whether it was in a glass, a window, or the still surface of a puddle, the shadow seemed to be there, just out of reach. The way it moved in the corners of my eyes, shifting, never quite still, was like a presence I couldn't outrun. I could hear it, feel it, even when it wasn't directly in front of me. And then, there were the sounds. The sounds that followed me everywhere. Late at night, when the world was still, I would hear them outside my window, soft footsteps, gentle but deliberate, as though something was circling my house, waiting for me to come outside. The cries that echoed through the trees were different now. They weren't just distant howls or animal calls. They were human, faint but unmistakable. It was as if someone, or something, was calling for help, my help. But no matter how hard I tried to understand it, I couldn't. I tried to block it out. I tried to go on with my life, act like things were normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every sound, every shadow, every reflection seemed to be taunting me. My days were filled with exhaustion, my nights with terror. And the longer I stayed here, the more I felt like I was losing myself to it, to the swamp, to the shadow. One night, unable to sleep again, I stood at my window, staring out into the dark. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the swamp. The silence was deafening. But even in that silence, I could feel the weight of something pressing in on me. I knew it was out there. Watching. Waiting. I turned my head quickly, sure I had seen something move in the corner of the yard. But when I looked, there was nothing. Only the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. But I didn't feel any relief. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling. Then, from the edge of the trees, I heard it again. A whisper. A voice. My name. It was so soft, so faint, but I could hear it clearly. It was my voice. Calling to me. Pulling me toward the swamp. I felt my body betray me, my legs beginning to move before my mind could stop them. My feet carried me forward, almost of their own accord, as though the shadows themselves had reached out and wrapped around my soul. I couldn't stop it. And as I stepped into the cold night, I knew one thing for certain: the shadow wasn't just something I could run from. It was already inside me. And it was only a matter of time before it took me completely. It happened so fast, so suddenly, that I didn't have time to think. One moment, I was standing by the water's edge, trying to steady my breath and convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. The next, the shadow, the thing, was there again, but it was different. It was no longer a fleeting shape, no longer a trick of the light. It was solid, shifting, an entity that moved with purpose, as though it had been waiting for me to return. Waiting for this moment. I had tried to stay away. Tried to tell myself that if I didn't go back to the swamp, if I didn't confront whatever it was, maybe it would leave me alone. But the pull of it, the curiosity, the need for answers, it had brought me back. The water was still, almost too still. The kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, like the calm before a storm. But as I peered into the dark depths, something stirred. A ripple, subtle at first, then growing wider, expanding across the surface of the water. The air felt heavier, thick with anticipation. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was about to happen. But I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were drawn to the center of the water, where the ripples converged, and there, rising slowly from the depths, was the shadow. It was no longer a fleeting outline, a flicker in the corner of my vision. It was fully formed, towering, its shape disturbing and wrong, as if it had been crafted from the very darkness of the swamp. Its limbs stretched out, long and thin, rippling in the water like liquid shadows. The edges of its form blurred, constantly shifting, as if the shadow was trying to become something else, something more. Something real. The creature's face, or what I thought was a face, emerged from the water, its features indistinct, just a mass of shifting darkness. Its eyes were nothing more than empty sockets, but they felt like eyes, watching, staring into me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks turned into something primal, something that shook me to my core. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee, to get as far from this thing as possible. But my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer presence of it. The shadow twisted and contorted, its form lengthening, shifting with an eerie fluidity. It moved like liquid smoke, creeping and crawling across the water, inching toward me. The air around me thickened, the oppressive weight of its presence closing in on me. I could feel it, pressing against my skin, as if it were seeping into my very bones. My heart raced. The whispers started again, soft at first, but then louder, clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Words that I couldn't understand, but that felt like they were echoing directly into my mind. Come closer. Join us. I shook my head violently, trying to block it out, trying to push it away. But the words, the voice, they wouldn't leave me. It was as if the shadow was speaking directly to my thoughts, weaving into the fabric of my mind, trying to pull me under its control. I backed up, slowly at first, then more urgently. My feet were still rooted to the ground, but I fought against them, desperate to escape, desperate to get away from the water, from the thing that was coming for me. The shadow was rising higher now, its form elongating, its tendrils stretching toward me, reaching, trying to pull me in. I could hear the sound of water sloshing, the thick, wet noise as it moved closer, faster. A sharp, cold sensation wrapped around my chest, like fingers made of ice. It was pulling me toward the water, toward the shadow. I could feel it, almost as if the swamp itself had a hold on me, an invisible force drawing me closer to the thing in the water. I gasped for air, the panic rising in my throat, choking me. But somehow, I forced myself to take a step back. Then another. The shadow lurched forward, as if sensing my retreat. Its form expanded, becoming more defined, more solid, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. You can't escape. You belong to us now. I felt my knees shake, my body betraying me, but I refused to give in. I couldn't. I had to get away. I had to survive. I turned, finally breaking free from the trance, and ran. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breaths ragged and uneven. The sound of the water slapping against the shore, the faint whispering of the shadow, echoed in my ears as I bolted through the trees. Every footfall was heavy, every breath sharp with terror, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare stop. I didn't look back. But even as I fled, I could still feel it. The presence. The shadow. It was there, behind me, always just out of reach, and I knew that no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, it would follow. It had marked me. I could never escape. When I finally stumbled back to the edge of my property, breathless and shaking, I collapsed on the ground, my hands clutching the dirt, trying to anchor myself to the present. But the feeling, the weight of it, still clung to me. The shadow, the whispers, they were inside me now. I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the swamp anymore. It was me. And I had no idea how much longer I could hold on. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I couldn't even breathe without the weight of it pressing on my chest, suffocating me. The shadow. The water. The whispers. It had all become too much. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred until there was no difference, no safe place to hide. I was losing myself, bit by bit, as the darkness crept in, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. I hadn't gone back to the swamp since that night, since the shadow had come for me in that terrifying, solid form. Since it had tried to drag me into the water. I hadn't dared. But even in my isolation, even locked away in my own home, I could still hear it. The whispers. The voices. The call. Come back. It's waiting for you. I tried to drown it out. I filled my days with chores, with work, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the compulsion to return to the swamp grew stronger with each passing hour. It gnawed at me, relentless, insistent. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the undeniable pull of it. The shadow was waiting for me, calling me, and I had no idea why. Every time I tried to rationalize it, to explain away what had happened, the shadow was there, waiting, laughing at my feeble attempts to reason. I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. I had seen it. I had felt it. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real, and it was coming for me. Yet, despite everything, despite the terror it instilled in me, I couldn't deny the pull. The voices were getting louder, clearer. They called my name, soft and sweet, almost like a lullaby. Come home. And when I closed my eyes, I could see it, the swamp, dark and inviting, the shadows swirling beneath the surface like a living thing. The thought of it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. I tried to convince myself that I was losing my mind, that I had spent too many sleepless nights, too much time alone in this house, and it was all just a manifestation of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of being alone. But deep down, I knew better. I knew something was calling me back to that place. And the more I fought it, the stronger it became. I sat on my porch one evening, staring out into the fading light, trying to gather my thoughts. The crickets chirped, the wind rustled the trees, but everything felt off, like the world was holding its breath. I glanced toward the swamp in the distance. The trees there were thick, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers, reaching for me. It felt like it was alive. It felt like it was waiting. I gripped the railing of the porch, my knuckles white, trying to steady myself. But then the whispers came again, louder this time, urgent. It's time. You can't hide anymore. My breath hitched in my throat, and I looked away, desperately trying to focus on something, anything, other than the swamp. But it was as if my body was no longer listening to me. My legs ached to move, to walk toward it, to return to the place that had become both my prison and my obsession. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. No. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't face the shadow again. I had barely escaped last time. If I went back, I knew it would take me. There was no question about it. But the pull was too strong. I didn't know how long I sat there, torn between my fear and the overwhelming need to return. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to leave this place, to get as far away from the swamp as possible. But I couldn't. I could feel it, deep inside me, a compulsion, like an invisible thread pulling me back toward the water, toward the thing that had marked me. The rational part of my mind, the part that used to make sense of everything, was slowly breaking apart. I knew what I was feeling wasn't normal. I knew that my thoughts, my fear, were becoming irrational. But it didn't matter. I couldn't stop it. The longer I fought it, the more intense the need became. It was like the shadow had embedded itself deep within me, crawling under my skin, filling every thought, every heartbeat, until there was nothing left but the desire to return. I stood up, my legs trembling. I could feel the ground beneath my feet, but it didn't feel real anymore. It felt distant, as if I were floating, disconnected from everything that once made sense. I walked toward the edge of the porch, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The swamp called to me. The shadows beckoned, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face the terror that awaited me, but I couldn't stop myself. The compulsion was too strong, the need too great. I took a step, then another, my body moving against my will. As I made my way toward the water, I heard the whispers again, clear as day. It's waiting for you. Come closer. My feet moved faster now, almost running, as if the shadow had already taken control of my mind, my body. I was no longer thinking. I was being led, drawn into the darkness. The further I walked, the closer I got, the more I could feel the chill of the swamp air, the oppressive silence that pressed down on me. I was close now, so close. And then I heard it, a splash. It was as if the swamp had taken a breath, and the shadow, or whatever it was, had awakened once more. The closer I got to the swamp, the more I could feel it, the heavy weight of the darkness pressing in on me. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, thick enough to taste, and the trees around me seemed to bend inward, closing off any escape. Every step felt like a step deeper into the unknown, deeper into something that didn't belong in the world I knew. I had made it this far. I had answered the call, whether I wanted to or not. And now, I couldn't stop myself. But as I reached the water's edge, I stopped. The whispers had stopped. The world around me was eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like a breath held too long. The shadow was there, lurking beneath the surface of the water, just out of sight, waiting for me to make the next move. I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest, suffocating me. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it win. Desperation clamped down on me like a vice. My heart pounded in my chest, and the panic that had been gnawing at me for weeks finally broke through the surface. I was going mad. I was mad, wasn't I? But no! I couldn't let myself believe that. Not yet. If I was going to survive this, I had to fight back. I had to do something, anything. I turned, running back through the trees, back toward the house. I had to find answers. I had to find something, some way to stop this, to stop it from taking me, from making me its next victim. The house was quiet, but I knew it wouldn't be for long. The shadow was out there, and sooner or later, it would come for me again. I couldn't wait. I couldn't just sit here, letting it take control. I needed a plan, a way to fight back. I rushed into the attic, a place I hadn't thought about in years. Dust and cobwebs filled the air as I rifled through old boxes, searching for anything that might give me an answer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The air was thick with that same oppressive silence. There had to be something here. Something old. Something that might help me. I found it. In the far corner, tucked away in an old trunk, was a pile of dusty books, worn and forgotten. My grandmother's collection of old texts, superstitions, charms, local folklore. She had always believed in the old ways, the ways of the swamp, and I had thought she was just a superstitious woman who liked her old stories. But now it felt like everything she had said was true. The warnings. The legends. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling, my mind racing. There were mentions of spirits, swamp spirits that lived in the water, creatures of the dark that lured people to their deaths. And then, in the back of one book, I found something that caught my eye, a ritual, a binding spell, meant to drive away evil spirits from the land. It wasn't much, just a few words, a few ingredients. But it was the only thing I had. It was the only chance I had left. I read the words aloud, but even as I spoke them, a chill crept down my spine. Was it really going to work? How could it? How could any of this stop the thing that had been stalking me, that had been getting closer and closer every night? But I had to try. I couldn't just let it drag me under. I gathered what I could, salt, herbs, candles, things my grandmother had once used for her own charms and rituals. The swamp spirit had to be bound, pushed away, or whatever it was. I needed to stop it from coming any closer. I set up the ritual outside, near the edge of the swamp, where the shadows seemed to linger the most. The air felt heavier as I prepared the space, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I placed the salt in a circle, lit the candles, and began the incantation, my voice shaky but firm. But nothing happened. The wind didn't change. The shadows didn't move. The water remained still. It was as if the ritual had no power at all. I felt my heart sink. Maybe I was too late. Maybe the shadow had already claimed me, already marked me, and nothing I did would change that. But I couldn't give up. I wouldn't. The whispers started again. Soft, distant at first, like a breath against my ear. But this time, they were different. There was an urgency to them, a malice, a hunger that hadn't been there before. It's too late. You can't escape. We'll come for you. I closed my eyes, clenching my fists around the herbs, around the charm I had made. I had to stop it. I had to. The air around me grew colder, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with something unnatural. The shadow was close now. It was moving toward me, creeping across the water, stretching out like a dark hand, pulling itself free from the depths. I could feel the water rise around my ankles, hear the soft sloshing sound as it began to seep closer, pulling me in. Panic rose in my chest again, choking me, but I fought it down. I had to stay calm. I had to finish the ritual. I spoke the words again, louder this time, my voice stronger despite the terror clawing at me. I was shaking, my body trembling, but I couldn't stop now. The words felt like a lifeline, like they could somehow pull me back from the edge, back from the shadow's grasp. The water surged, almost as if responding to my plea. I didn't dare look at the shadow, didn't dare look at what it had become. But I could feel it, could feel the darkness pressing in on me, threatening to swallow me whole. Stay strong. I repeated the words in my mind. I had to stay strong. The final words of the incantation left my mouth, trembling but clear. And then, nothing. A deep silence filled the air. The whispering stopped. The water stilled. And I thought, for a moment, that I had won. That the shadow was gone. But then I felt it, a hand, cold as ice, wrap around my ankle. It wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The hand around my ankle didn't feel like it belonged to anything human. It was cold, slick, like the water itself had come alive, reaching up from the depths to drag me under. I jerked my leg back, but the grip tightened. My breath hitched in my throat, and panic surged through me, making my head spin. I couldn't stop it. No matter how hard I pulled, the shadow was pulling me deeper. I had to get away. I had to break free. But every time I moved, the pull grew stronger, as if the swamp itself were trying to hold me, to drag me into its dark embrace. I looked around, trying to find something, anything to help me. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches stretching out like gnarled hands, their shadows heavy and oppressive. The only sound I could hear now was the rapid pounding of my heart and the cold slapping of the water against my legs as I struggled to free myself. "Let go," I whispered to the shadows, my voice barely a croak. But they didn't listen. It didn't matter that I was pleading. The shadow was relentless. The darkness was hungry. The whispers came again. They were louder now, surrounding me, filling my head with words I couldn't understand, words that weren't meant for human ears. But there was one clear thing in the cacophony: come deeper. Come closer. It's waiting for you. It was all I could do to keep my footing in the thick, sticky mud of the swamp. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the earth sinking away like it was alive, pulling me toward the heart of the swamp. I could feel the pull now, not just from the water, but from the very land itself, dragging me deeper into the suffocating darkness. I tried to backpedal, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and unresponsive. The shadow was there, stretching out before me, moving like liquid smoke across the water, beckoning, calling me into the depths. It knew my every move, my every thought. It was toying with me, making sure I couldn't escape, that I couldn't leave. But still, I fought. I fought against the pull. I fought against the whispers that were now filling my ears, their intensity growing as I was drawn deeper into the swamp. The cold air around me thickened, pressing in from all sides, choking me. The trees seemed to bend closer, their dark silhouettes blending with the shadow in the water. I couldn't see clearly anymore. Everything was a blur, twisted, distorted by the creeping fear that had taken hold of me. I tried to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the swamp. There was no one. No one to hear me. No one to save me. The realization hit me hard, a gut-wrenching wave of terror. I was alone. I was completely alone. The isolation was unbearable. There was no escape from the depths of the swamp, no way back to the safety of my home, no path leading me out of this nightmare. The further I walked, the more I felt the distance grow between me and the world I had known. The swamp was all-consuming, its silence deafening, its shadows pressing in, suffocating me. The calls from the shadow were growing more distinct now, each one ringing louder, each one louder than my own thoughts. "Come closer," it whispered. "Come deeper. There's nowhere left to run." I stumbled through the muck, my legs heavy, my breath ragged. The ground seemed to shift beneath me with each step, and I had no idea where I was anymore. The landmarks I had once known, trees, rocks, the familiar trails I had walked on countless times, were gone. I was lost. Completely lost. I couldn't see the stars above, couldn't see the moon. The canopy of trees had closed in, wrapping the swamp in a dark, suffocating blanket. It was as if the world had vanished, leaving only the shadow, leaving only the whispers. "Come closer," it whispered again, and this time, I didn't just hear it, I felt it. It was inside my mind, inside my skin. It was calling to me, reaching into the depths of my soul, pulling me deeper. I tried to scream, tried to fight, but there was nothing I could do. I was too far from safety now. There was no path to follow back. I was sinking into the swamp, sinking into the shadow's grip, and I couldn't stop it. The fear that had taken root in my chest was now all-encompassing. It was like drowning in air, suffocating under the weight of my own helplessness. The water lapped at my ankles, my knees, pulling me forward with every step, as if the swamp itself was alive and breathing, as if it could sense my fear. The shadow, the thing that had haunted me from the moment I set foot near the water, was getting closer, stretching its form like a dark reflection of the trees around me. I was too far now. There was no turning back. The shadows wrapped around me like a thick, suffocating fog, and I felt the ground beneath my feet give way. My heart raced as my body moved of its own accord, carried deeper into the dark, cold heart of the swamp. "There is no escape," it whispered. And I knew, deep down, that it was right. I had known, deep down, that the swamp was never just a swamp. It was something older, something darker. The moment I had set foot near its edge, the moment I had heard the whispers, I should have understood. I should have run then, when there was still time. But now, it was too late for escape. I could feel it closing in on me, surrounding me from all sides. The shadow wasn't just a figment of my imagination anymore. It wasn't some trick of the light or a fleeting glimpse of movement in the water. No, it was real. The stories were true. The whispers, the calls, the eerie sensation of being watched, they had all been signs, and I had ignored them, dismissing them as fear or stress or exhaustion. But now, I knew better. The shadow wasn't a simple ghost or spirit. It was an entity. A force of nature, ancient and cruel, something that had existed in the swamp long before I ever came to be. It didn't want me to merely fear it. It wanted me to become part of it, to be lost in its darkness, consumed by its hunger. And if I didn't stop it now, if I didn't find a way to destroy it, I would be just another name on the list of the missing, another soul claimed by the swamp. I couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. I knew I had no choice but to fight back. It was the only way I could regain control, the only way I could break free from its grip. I had spent days preparing for this moment. Days of research, days of gathering what little I could find, old texts, forgotten charms, stories passed down through generations. Anything that might help me stand a chance. The ritual had failed, but there had to be another way. There had to be a way to banish the shadow, to send it back to the depths from which it came. I made my way to the small shed behind the house, the one that had once stored tools and supplies. Now, it would house my weapons. Inside, the air smelled like rust and decay, the walls lined with forgotten remnants of the past. I didn't care about the old tools, the broken machinery. I was looking for something specific, something to defend myself, something to give me a fighting chance. My eyes landed on a metal box in the corner, buried beneath a pile of old tarps. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside, nestled between layers of cloth, were my father's old hunting knives. I hadn't thought about them in years, not since he had died. But now, they were all that stood between me and the darkness. I took them in my hands, feeling the weight of the blades. There were two of them, both sharp and deadly, their handles worn from years of use. These knives were tools of survival, and right now, they were my only hope. I didn't know if they would work against the shadow, but I had to try. I set the knives down carefully and turned to the next item on my list, amulets. My grandmother had always kept a small collection of charms and trinkets she believed would protect her from evil. They were relics of an old world, filled with meaning and power. I had been too skeptical to believe in them when I was younger, but now, in the face of the shadow, I was willing to try anything. I found this small wooden box, tucked away beneath a stack of old clothes, and opened it. Inside were several amulets, some with symbols I didn't understand, others made from materials that seemed ancient. A few were made from bone, others from stones I'd never seen before. My grandmother had always been the superstitious one, but now I felt a flicker of hope. These could be my only chance to protect myself. I chose 2 amulets, both small and unassuming, but something about them felt right. One was made from a smooth, dark stone with a carving I couldn't quite make out, and the other was a small bundle of dried herbs wrapped in string. I didn't know how they worked or if they would work at all, but I couldn't afford to second-guess myself now. I strapped the knives to my belt, tucked the amulets into my pocket, and stood in the middle of the room, trying to steady my breathing. There was no going back. The shadow was coming for me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed me. I could feel it now, like a pulse in the air, a low hum vibrating through the walls of the house. It was out there, waiting for me. I had to go to it. I had to face it. The swamp had already taken so much from me, my peace, my sanity, my safety. I wouldn't let it take my life. I stepped outside, the night air thick and heavy with moisture. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the stars above seemed dim and far away. The world felt distant, as if I were walking in a dream, one that I couldn't wake from. I walked toward the edge of the swamp, the place where it all began. The water was still now, almost unnaturally so, and the trees stood like silent guardians, their twisted branches reaching out as if to warn me. But I didn't listen to the warning. I couldn't. The shadow was close. I could feel it. I whispered the words my grandmother had taught me long ago, words I had always dismissed as superstition. But now, they felt real. Powerful. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to face it. The shadow was waiting. The air around me grew heavier as I stepped closer to the water's edge. I could feel it now, the presence. The shadow had been waiting for me, and it was here. I had thought it was just a force, a dark specter, but now, as I stood on the brink of the swamp, I could feel it becoming something more. Something real. The wind shifted, and the water rippled gently in response. But it wasn't just the wind, it was the shadow, moving. It wasn't invisible anymore. The dark shape had become more defined, more solid, coalescing like smoke into something almost human. It loomed before me, an indistinct figure of darkness with a faint, shifting outline, like the silhouette of a person, but wrong. It didn't belong here. Not in the world I knew. I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine, but I refused to let it control me. I was prepared. I had knives. I had amulets. I had the determination to end this nightmare once and for all. The shadow had haunted me for too long. But then, it spoke. It didn't make a sound at first. There were no words. But I could hear it in my mind, a voice that was both distant and intimate, like a whisper in my ear that came from somewhere deep inside me. "You've come to face me, haven't you?" The voice was chilling, smooth, and somehow familiar. My heart skipped a beat, the words echoing in my mind like a reflection of my own thoughts. The shadows seemed to know me, to understand me on a level deeper than anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just taunting me, it was reaching into the darkest parts of my soul. "You think you can stop me? You think you can fight me with your knives and charms? You can't escape me. You never could." I gripped the knives tighter, feeling the cool metal dig into my palms, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. It was right. How could I fight something that already knew my every fear, my every regret? The figure shifted, becoming clearer, more defined. It was no longer just a dark mist. Now, it had form, a human-like shape, with long, flowing tendrils of shadow that flickered and danced around it like some kind of dark flame. It didn't have a face, not really. But I could feel its eyes, cold, empty, like twin voids, watching me, piercing through every wall I had built inside myself. "You spent your life running from your own past," it whispered, and this time I felt it in my chest, as if the words were coming from the very air around me, curling into my lungs. "You think you can hide from your fears, but I am your fear. I know every dark corner of your mind." I felt my stomach twist. It was reading me, digging into the parts of me I had tried so hard to bury. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a manifestation of everything I had avoided. Every moment of regret, every fear that had kept me up at night, was now standing in front of me, taking form in the darkness. "Do you remember your sister?" The voice was softer now, but no less menacing. "Do you remember how you left her when she needed you most? how you ignored her cries for help. My breath caught in my throat. That was the wound, the one I could never heal. It had been years, but the guilt still ate at me. My sister had needed me, but I had been too focused on my own life to see the signs. And then, one day, she was gone. Just like that. I shook my head, trying to silence the voice. No, I whispered. It's not real. You're not real. But it wasn't listening. The shadow seemed to grow stronger, its form becoming more defined, more solid, as if the fear it fed on was making it more powerful. Asterisk, I am real, asterisk, it growled, a hint of amusement in its tone. And I am your fear. I am the shadow in the water, the darkness in your heart. You've been running your whole life, running from the things you can't face. And now, you're here. And you'll never escape. The air around me thickened, the swamp growing still as the shadows seemed to loom larger, its tendrils twisting around the trees, wrapping the very world in its dark embrace. I could feel my knees begin to shake. The knives seemed to grow heavier in my hands, the amulets in my pocket burning like fire. I took a step back, but it was like the shadow was drawing me in, pulling me toward it. Its whispers grew louder, more insistent. You've always been weak. You've always been scared. But now, you're in my domain. And you can't run anymore. My heart raced, the weight of its words pressing down on me. I had always been afraid. I had spent my life running from my past, running from the things I couldn't change. But now, facing the shadow, I realized something. I wasn't just afraid of the darkness, I was afraid of facing myself. Of confronting the things I had buried, the things I could never undo. But the shadow had made one mistake. It thought it could break me. It thought it could use my regrets against me. But it didn't know what I had learned in all these years. I wasn't the scared child anymore. I wasn't the person who ran away. I was the one who had come back to fight. And the shadow was about to find out that I wasn't going down without a fight. I stood there, staring into the abyss of the swamp, my hands clutching the cold steel of the knives as though they were my last tether to the world I once knew. The air around me had grown impossibly still, as though the entire swamp was holding its breath. Even the usual chorus of croaking frogs and the distant hum of insects had fallen silent. It was as if the world itself had paused, watching, waiting for what would happen next. I could feel the shadow, its presence swirling in the depths of the water. It was close now, so close I could taste the rot in the air. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled my lungs, mixing with the growing sense of dread that was pressing down on me from all sides. The very swamp felt suffocating, as if it had wrapped its tendrils around my chest, squeezing out any hope of escape. The shadow's voice echoed in my mind again, but this time there was no taunt, no playful mockery. It was pure, unbridled malice. It had grown tired of toying with me. It wanted me to feel its power, to know that I was completely and utterly alone. You are mine now, it whispered. The words were both a promise and a threat, and they sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't dare speak, didn't dare make a sound. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't leave, not now, not when the shadow had already seen through me, had already claimed me in ways I could never have imagined. The water in front of me shifted, a ripple breaking the stillness. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement beneath the surface, something dark, something that shouldn't have been there. My heart raced, and I gripped the knives tighter. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow was coming for me. I took a slow step forward, my boot sinking slightly into the damp earth, and I felt it, a coldness like nothing I had ever known. It wasn't just the temperature dropping, it was a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my very bones, freezing me in place. It spread through my limbs, tightening around my chest, and suddenly it felt like I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow's grip was tightening, slowly but surely, wrapping itself around me in a way that no weapon, no charm could break. I glanced around, desperately searching for any sign of life, any sound of movement, any sign that I wasn't completely alone. But the swamp remained as still as death. No birds, no frogs, no rustling in the trees. Just the sound of my heartbeat in my ears and the low hum of the shadow, getting closer, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I could feel it now. The shadow had come closer, its form growing more solid, more tangible in the space between us. It loomed in the water, its shape twisting and flickering like a shadow cast by a flame, but darker, deeper. It was as if the very essence of the swamp had formed into something malevolent, something that thrived on fear and regret. For the first time, I saw its face, or at least, what could be called a face. It was a collection of shifting, vague shapes, like black smoke rising from the water. Its eyes, or what seemed to be eyes, burned with an eerie, cold glow. There were no features, no expression, just that terrible, knowing gaze that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. "You've come," the shadow murmured, its voice sliding through the air like oil, dark and slick. "I've been waiting." I didn't answer. My mind was racing, but I couldn't focus. The cold was unbearable, suffocating, and my thoughts felt like they were slipping away, drowned by the sheer weight of the shadow's presence. The knives in my hands felt like they had turned to lead, their weight dragging me down, pulling me closer to the swamp, closer to the water where the shadow was waiting. I could hear the faintest sound, a whispering hiss, like 100 voices murmuring at once, just out of reach. The sound intensified, growing louder, until it became a cacophony, filling my head with maddening fragments of words, snippets of memories, regrets, fears, all of them mine. "You should have saved her." I staggered, my breath catching. It was the voice of my sister, her pleading, desperate words echoing in my ears. The pain, the guilt, the weight of that moment when I turned my back on her, when I let her slip away, it all came rushing back in a flood, drowning me in the suffocating regret I had lived with for so long. I shook my head violently, trying to push the memories away. I couldn't let it get to me. I couldn't let it win. I wasn't going to let it consume me like it had with so many others. I stood my ground, my teeth clenched, but my legs felt like jelly, trembling beneath me. The shadow was laughing now, that same mocking, cold laugh that sent chills down my spine. It knew my every weakness, my every doubt. It knew exactly how to break me, how to make me question everything I had believed in. "I am your fear," the shadow hissed. "And I have always been with you. You cannot escape me." The darkness seemed to close in, the edges of the world blurring into nothingness. The sense of isolation was unbearable now. I was no longer standing in the swamp, I was drowning in it, swallowed whole by its depths, its endless night. I could hear the shadow's whispers growing louder, suffocating me. But then, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. I lifted the knives in trembling hands, ready to fight, ready to face whatever this nightmare had become. Even if I was alone, even if the world had turned its back on me, I wasn't going to let the swamp take me. Not without a fight. The shadow moved, and I charged. The moment I lunged forward, the shadow met me with an overwhelming force. It wasn't like any creature I had ever encountered. There was no solid body to strike, no flesh to pierce. It was like trying to fight smoke, trying to stab at the darkness itself. Yet, somehow, it was solid, pushing back, pressing on me like a force of nature, its coldness gnawing at my skin, my bones. I swung the knives with all the strength I had, slashing through the air where I thought the shadow might be, but each swing passed through it like it was nothing more than mist. I could feel it wrap around me, curling like tendrils of ice, cutting through my skin without leaving a mark. The air thickened, growing so cold it felt like it was freezing me from the inside out. Then it hit me, really hit me. The shadows seemed to shift, coiling around me in an instant. A wave of suffocating cold wrapped around my chest, tightening with a grip so strong that I could barely breathe. It felt like the very life was being drained from my body, like it was sucking the warmth from my veins, leaving me hollow and weak. My hands trembled, the knives slipping from my grip as the shadow's tendrils dug into my arms, pulling me toward the water. "You're mine," the shadow whispered, its voice cold and mocking, slipping into my ears like a venomous whisper. "You always have been. You just never knew it." I struggled, my muscles aching from the pressure, but every movement felt sluggish. My head spun as the shadow's coldness seeped deeper, its darkness clouding my thoughts. I could hear it, feel it, the weight of every regret, every fear, every mistake I had ever made, flooding my mind. The guilt of my sister, the fear of losing control, the doubt in my own ability to survive, it all came rushing at me in a crushing wave. "You can't escape," it taunted, pulling harder, dragging me closer to the water's edge. I could see the murky depths swirling beneath me, and I knew if I went in, if I let it take me, there would be no coming back. Panic surged through me, raw and primal. I could feel the tears burning in my eyes, a mixture of fear and rage flooding my chest. I had no choice. I had to fight. With what strength I had left, I wrenched my body free from the shadow's grip, gasping for air as I scrambled backward. But the shadow was relentless, pressing forward with an inhuman speed. It lashed out again, tendrils wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. I fell, my knees slamming into the ground, and the shadow surged over me like a tide. The fear was overwhelming, utterly paralyzing. I could feel myself slipping, my hands reaching for something, anything to hold on to, but the swamp was nothing but cold, dark earth beneath me. My vision blurred. My heart raced. The shadow was everywhere, suffocating me from all sides. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the crushing darkness. The cold seeped deeper, like ice in my veins, and the shadow's voice whispered in my ear again, closer this time. "You're weak. You always have been." My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind barely able to focus. The weight of the shadow pressed on me like 1,000 crushing hands, dragging me into the water. I could feel the wetness on my skin, the cold of the swamp's depths reaching out to claim me. I tried to fight, tried to move, but my limbs were numb, my body paralyzed by the relentless chill of the shadow. The darkness was suffocating me, and for a moment, I thought I was lost. My mind began to slip away, overwhelmed by the weight of terror and helplessness. "You can't fight me," the shadow hissed, its voice echoing in my skull. "You will never escape." But then, something broke through. A small spark of clarity in the midst of the terror, a memory of something I had learned, something that could break this grip. I reached into my pocket, feeling the warmth of the amulet I had kept close. It wasn't much, just a trinket passed down from my grandmother, but in that moment it felt like my last hope. I pulled the amulet out, holding it tight in my hand, and whispered a prayer. It wasn't a spell. It wasn't a weapon. But it was all I had left. The shadow recoiled as if the amulet burned it, its tendrils retreating, pulling back from the light. I could feel it, just a glimmer of strength returning to me. The cold eased, just slightly, enough for me to move, to breathe. I didn't waste a second. I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling away from the water's edge, dragging my body through the muck. The shadow roared in fury, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I had to survive. Every step felt like I was dragging 1,000 pounds behind me, but the amulet was warm in my hand, and with it came a flicker of hope, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this fight. I couldn't let the shadow take me. Not now. Not ever. But as I ran, the whispering grew louder, the shadow's presence following me, lurking just out of reach. I didn't know if I could escape it for good, but one thing was certain, I wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The fight had only just begun. I stumbled back through the thick undergrowth of the swamp, each step feeling like I was wading through a nightmare. My breath came in jagged gasps, my body ached with the strain, and yet, I didn't stop. The amulet I held in my hand pulsed with a strange warmth, as though it recognized the danger that still lurked in the darkness. I could feel the shadow's presence following me, relentless, just beyond my sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. It wasn't gone. I hadn't defeated it. I had only pushed it back, delayed the inevitable. It was like pushing a storm back with a breath, temporary, fragile. But I couldn't let it win. Not now, not after everything. I had to keep moving, keep thinking, keep fighting. As I reached a clearing, my mind raced. My chest heaved with exhaustion, but my instincts were sharp, my thoughts cutting through the fog of panic. I needed to outsmart it. If I couldn't destroy it, if my weapons and charms couldn't stop it, I needed to make it believe I was more than just prey. I had to find its weakness. The water around me rippled again, and I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to lose focus. The shadow was closing in, just a step behind me. But I had something it didn't, a mind still in control. For now, I was the hunter, not the hunted. I could hear its whispers, soft and insidious, crawling into my thoughts, pushing at the edges of my sanity. You can't escape. I will find you again. But I had already made my choice. The only way to defeat it was to make it fear me as much as I feared it. I remembered the stories from the old woman, the ones I had dismissed as folklore. She had said the shadow was drawn to the very thing it wanted most, control. Fear. Helplessness. It fed on them. And then, in a flash, something clicked. I wasn't going to give it control anymore. I wasn't going to give in to fear. I reached into the pocket of my jacket, fingers trembling but determined, and pulled out the small jar of salt I had gathered earlier from the village. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The old woman had told me salt could purify, could drive away malevolent spirits. Maybe it wasn't just folklore. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was the only thing I had left to try. I threw the salt into the air, watching as it scattered across the clearing. The shadow screamed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the swamp, shaking the trees, rattling the leaves. For a moment, it faltered. The cold that had been pressing against me seemed to ebb, and the oppressive weight lifted, if only for a heartbeat. It was enough. In the instant of its retreat, I grabbed the amulet with both hands, pressing it to my chest. I whispered the words I could barely remember, the prayer the old woman had taught me. I didn't know if it was the salt or the amulet or the force of my will, but something in that moment worked. The shadow recoiled further, swirling violently, like it was unraveling in the wind. I dared to take a step back, then another, inching away from the clearing, away from the water, my eyes scanning the dark edges of the swamp. The shadow howled in frustration, its voice more desperate now, but still, it didn't fade. It was only retreating, buying time. And that's when I realized I hadn't beaten it. It wasn't gone. It wasn't weakened. It was just waiting. The shadow had been around long enough to know patience. It knew when to pull back, when to lull its prey into a false sense of security. It knew that the fear it caused would drive me to make mistakes. It would wait for me to slip, to falter. It wasn't interested in rushing. It would pick the moment when I was at my weakest, when I was tired, when my defenses were down. I could hear it, feel it, almost taste it in the air. The shadow wasn't gone. It was just lurking in the dark corners of the swamp, its cold presence still hovering in the periphery. I wasn't free. Not yet. But I had bought myself a moment. A fleeting, fragile moment. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, but this time, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't running from a monster. I was running toward a fight that I would win, not by strength, not by weapons, but by my will to survive. I couldn't let the shadow claim me, no matter how long it waited, no matter how many times it returned. I would face it, again and again, until it learned that I was not its prey. It had only delayed the inevitable. And now, I was prepared for the next round. I ran back to the village, my feet heavy with dread, my body drained by the encounter. Every step seemed like an effort to outrun the darkness still chasing me, but I knew it wasn't truly behind me anymore. It was all around me now. The swamp, the shadow, it had already seeped into my thoughts, into my bones. I had to warn them. I had to make them understand. But as I reached the village, something didn't feel right. The usual stillness that hung in the air was thicker today, oppressive in a way that made my chest tighten. The usual sounds, the chatter of the townspeople, the low hum of daily life, were absent. The roads, usually dotted with a handful of locals, were empty. I quickened my pace, but the quiet only seemed to grow more intense. The houses sat dark and abandoned, their doors shut tight, their windows like hollow eyes staring out at the empty streets. It was as if the whole town had packed up and vanished in the span of a few hours. I stopped at the first house I saw, knocking on the door with urgency, my knuckles rapping against the old wood. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. With a growing sense of dread, I pushed the door open, calling out into the empty house, but no one answered. Dust had gathered along the floors, the air stale with neglect. This place had been abandoned for longer than I had realized. I moved to the next house, repeating the same actions, but with the same result. It was as though the entire village had been swallowed up by the swamp, consumed by the fear of the very legend I had tried to dismiss. I walked through the eerily silent streets, my thoughts spiraling. Had they known? Did they understand the shadow's true power even before I did? Or was it just the stories, those whispered tales of the swamp spirit, that had driven them away? They didn't need to see the shadow to fear it. They had heard the stories, seen the disappearances. That was enough to make them run. I reached the center of the village, where the old church stood. The door creaked as I pushed it open, my breath catching as I stepped inside. The pews were empty, the candles snuffed out, and a layer of dust covered everything. The silence here was different, deeper, as if the very building was holding its breath. I didn't have time for this. I couldn't afford to waste any more energy on this quiet ghost town. I had to get back to the swamp, had to find a way to stop the shadow for good. But before I could turn to leave, I noticed something. A small piece of paper, crumpled and half hidden beneath one of the pews. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. It was a note, hastily scribbled, the ink smeared in places. We know what it wants. We know what it needs. It waits for those who don't believe. It waits for those who think they can escape. It will not stop until it has taken everything. The words burned into my mind. They were written in desperation, but there was no signature, no name to identify the writer. The message was clear, though. They knew. The villagers had known. The shadow had already claimed them. I felt the coldness creep up my spine as I stood there, the weight of the note pressing down on me. Had I been too late? Had they left because they had already given up? Or was it the fear that had driven them to flee, believing they couldn't stop what was coming? It didn't matter. I couldn't give up. I turned and left the church, stepping back out into the village. The streets were still empty, the houses still abandoned. But I knew one thing for certain now, the shadow had already set its trap. The village was just the beginning. The real battle would take place at the heart of the swamp, where the darkness had first taken root. And if I didn't stop it now, I would be the next to vanish without a trace. Swamp Shadow from Louisiana. Chapter 6, The Final Trap. Part 2, Feeling trapped and alone, the protagonist returns to their home, knowing that the shadow is still waiting. I trudged back through the village, my mind spinning with the crumpled note I had found. The words burned in my thoughts, repeating over and over, like a mantra I couldn't escape. It waits for those who don't believe. I couldn't let myself think about the villagers. Couldn't let myself dwell on the idea that they had fled, abandoning everything out of fear. Fear of what? Of something they couldn't even see? The shadow was real. I had felt it, seen it. But could it really be powerful enough to make an entire village vanish? The answer pressed on my chest as I returned to my house, and the once familiar surroundings felt suffocating now. The walls that had provided safety, the rooms where I'd lived in isolation, now felt like a cage. The windows were locked tight, the door secured. But I knew none of it would matter. The shadow didn't need doors to get in. I entered the house, slamming the door behind me as though the action could somehow shield me from what was out there. The silence was overwhelming. The heavy air pressed against me, and I swore I could almost hear the whispers of the shadow just beyond the walls. I couldn't stay here. But where could I go? I sank down on the couch, my head in my hands, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The village, the empty streets, the note. It was all a trap. A trap that had already been set, and I had walked right into it, blind and desperate for answers. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. The shadow was waiting. I could feel it, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I looked around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting it to leap out at any moment. It wasn't just in the swamp anymore. It had followed me back here. It was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to let my guard down. I got up and started pacing, unable to sit still for more than a few seconds. Every noise in the house, creaking floors, the whisper of wind against the window, felt like it was the shadow, testing me, watching, learning my weaknesses. I went to the window and peered out into the darkness. The swamp lay beyond, an endless stretch of black water and shadows. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. It always was. My mind raced. I had tried everything. The salt. The amulet. The old woman's warnings. Nothing had stopped it. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I had made a terrible mistake by coming back here. I had been foolish to think I could face it alone. I needed help. I needed to get out of this place before it consumed me too. But the village was gone. And where could I go? The shadow had already claimed the land around me. The swamp had become a part of me now, an inescapable, suffocating weight. The walls of my house felt like they were closing in. I tried to shake the feeling off, to think rationally. The shadow wasn't just a force of nature, it was a trap. A lure. It fed on fear, on desperation. It was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to give in. I couldn't let it. I wouldn't. But as I stood there, staring out at the stillness, I realized just how little control I truly had. The more I fought, the more it felt like the shadow was pulling the strings. It had always been there, waiting, feeding on my fear. I had walked into its domain, and now it would not let me leave. The darkness beyond the windows seemed to shift, a subtle movement that made my blood run cold. It was there. It was always there. I turned away from the window, feeling the weight of its gaze even though I couldn't see it. I didn't need to. I had already lost. And I knew, deep down, that no matter what I did, the shadow was going to win in the end. But not today. Not yet. The question remained, would I ever truly escape? Or was that just another name on the list of those who had walked into the swamp, never to return? The decision was made. I had to leave. There was no choice anymore. The village had already fallen to the shadow, and now it was closing in on me. My house, my once safe haven, felt like nothing more than a tomb now. Each corner of it seemed to whisper my name, the walls closing in, suffocating me. I packed quickly, throwing my belongings into a bag with shaky hands. The urgency, the need to escape, clawed at me, but it was paired with a cold sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The shadow was already here. It wasn't waiting for me to leave. It was already inside, lurking in the very air I breathed. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the air seemed to freeze. I felt it before I saw it, the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, that the walls themselves were closing in. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the door handle so tightly it hurt. There was a sound, faint at first, a soft, almost imperceptible creak of the floorboards behind me. But it wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Something wrong. I turned slowly, the blood draining from my face as I stared into the hallway, which had somehow grown darker. The light from the lamp flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and sway as though they had a life of their own. And then I saw it. It was a shadow within a shadow, darkness that didn't belong, moving without cause, shifting and slithering like a living thing. The shape was distorted, impossible to define, but its presence filled the room with a chilling sense of inevitability. The door was still behind me, but it felt miles away. Every inch of the house now seemed to be infused with the shadow, seeping through the cracks in the walls, the corners of the ceiling. I could hear it now, two whispers, barely audible, like a breath of wind, but they were coming from everywhere. The sound of my name being spoken in a voice not quite my own. I wanted to run. I had to run. But my feet wouldn't move. My legs were like stone, rooted to the floor, unwilling to take the first step. The shadow had already found me. There was no escape. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The light flickered once more and went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But there was no rational explanation. There was nothing I could do to fight it anymore. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now, voices of those who had vanished, their tones pleading, mocking, desperate. I recognized some of the voices, the names of people who had disappeared over the years, people who had been swallowed by the swamp. And now, their voices were part of the shadow, part of the thing that had come to claim me. The house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the walls closing in, the air pressing down on me. I stumbled toward the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the door was fused with the frame, locked in place by some unseen force. Panic flooded my chest, and I pushed harder, slamming my shoulder into the door, but it refused to give. I turned to the window, but the shadow was there too. It was already outside, creeping across the glass, blocking out the light. The water beyond the glass seemed to shimmer, moving unnaturally, as though the swamp itself was reaching toward me. I was trapped. The floor beneath me groaned as if something heavy was shifting within the walls, and then the shadow moved closer. It wasn't just an impression anymore. It was real, tangible, pressing against me like a physical weight. The coldness wrapped around me, and the darkness felt like it was clawing at my skin. I backed away, my hands trembling as I grabbed anything I could find, furniture, broken pieces of furniture, anything to defend myself. But nothing would stop it. I knew that now. It was pointless. The whispers turned into laughter, hollow and cruel, echoing through the house. It was waiting. It had always been waiting for me to return. For me to give up, to let it in. And now, it had me. The last remnants of hope I'd clung to were crumbling, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The door finally gave way, but it wasn't the relief I had expected. It was the shadow, forcing its way in, flooding the room with an overwhelming presence, as if the very essence of the swamp had come alive. I took a final, desperate step back, but the shadow was there, consuming everything in its path. And I was no longer sure whether I was being swallowed by the shadow, or whether the shadow had been inside me all along. My mind was numb with panic, but I knew I couldn't stay here, not anymore. The shadow had taken my house, and I could feel its presence pressing in, wrapping its cold fingers around me, slowly suffocating me. I had to leave. I had to escape the swamp before it swallowed me whole, like it had done to so many others before me. I ran to the door, heart pounding, desperate for any chance to break free. The night air outside seemed like my only hope, the swamp's suffocating grip not yet reaching the outside world. I yanked open the door and stepped outside into the humid night. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. But as soon as I stepped onto the porch, the air shifted. The swamp was alive, watching, waiting. The moment my feet hit the ground, I realized something was wrong. The familiar sounds of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, were gone. Instead, a heavy silence pressed down, like the entire world was holding its breath. The ground beneath me felt unnaturally soft, the earth giving way as if it had never been solid at all. The trees loomed taller than I. Remembered, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for me, the shadows of the swamp stretching impossibly long. I took a step forward, determined to run, but the path that had once been clear was now obscured. The winding trail I knew so well had vanished, swallowed by the swamp. Every direction seemed to lead back to the same place, the house, the cursed land that had bound me to it. I turned around in confusion, searching for a way out, but the porch was gone. The house had disappeared, replaced by an endless stretch of dark water and fog. The swamp was manipulating the land itself. The trees bent inward, their branches clawing at the sky like twisted fingers, closing off all paths. No matter how I looked at it, I was surrounded. I stumbled back, panic seizing me. I had to leave. I had to find an exit. The shadows pressed in tighter with every breath I took, as if the land itself was pushing me back. There was no way out. I tried running, forcing my way through the thick underbrush, but it only seemed to grow denser. The trees seemed to close in, their roots shifting beneath the ground, making each step feel like I was wading through thick mud. My clothes clung to me, heavy and wet, and the air grew thick with the smell of rotting earth. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence, mingling with a low, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. Run, run, run. The words echoed in my mind, but they were not my own. The shadow was speaking to me. I paused, straining my ears, trying to locate the source of the voice. But there was no one there. Just the endless, oppressive silence of the swamp. I looked behind me again. The path I had come from was no longer visible. The trees had shifted, their positions changing so that the way I had come was now completely blocked. The fog had thickened, curling around the trunks like an invisible hand, guiding me deeper into the swamp, forcing me into its grasp. I tried to go left. The path there was blocked by thick vines that wrapped around the trees like snakes, twisting and constricting until the opening I thought I saw vanished completely. I tried to go right. More branches, more thorns. It was like the swamp was alive, responding to my every movement, changing, adapting to keep me trapped. I turned again and tried to retrace my steps, desperate to find a familiar landmark, something to guide me, but it was as though the swamp was playing tricks on me. The trees, the water, the fog, it all blended together, and nothing looked the same anymore. Every step I took only seemed to push me further into its grip. The whispers were louder now, the voices blending together in an incomprehensible chant. It was as if the swamp itself was speaking to me, urging me forward, closer to its heart. I could feel the cold touch of the shadow at my back, its presence looming behind me, waiting for me to falter. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to breathe, unable to think. The sound of the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony that echoed in my skull, a constant hum that rattled my very bones. The shadow was everywhere now. The air, the water, the trees, they were all part of it. It had taken root in this land, and I was the prey it had been waiting for. I turned, hoping to run, but I froze. The water ahead had begun to move, rippling in unnatural patterns. From its depths, a figure began to rise, dark, formless, and shifting like liquid. It was the shadow, no longer just a presence, but a tangible force, emerging from the very heart of the swamp. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. There was nowhere to go. The swamp had become my prison, and the shadow had finally claimed me. The last thing I saw before the darkness overtook me was the shadow's eyes, deep, endless, and hungry, drawing me into the water, into the very heart of the swamp where I would disappear, just like all the others. There was no escape. The world around me had become a blur, a twisted version of reality, contorted and shifting. I had no sense of time anymore, no understanding of how much had passed since I tried to flee. All that remained was the suffocating presence of the swamp and the shadow that clung to me like a second skin. I stumbled through the thick fog, the air colder now, more oppressive. My steps were slow, unsure, as if my body didn't belong to me anymore. I was still moving, but each motion felt like it wasn't my own. The swamp seemed to bend in on itself, the trees bowing as I passed, their branches scratching at my skin. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, shifting, as if it could swallow me whole at any moment. And then, suddenly, it hit me. I wasn't in control anymore. The realization hit like a wave crashing over me. My every movement, every breath, every desperate attempt to escape had been guided by something else. The shadow had been pulling the strings, shaping the very environment around me, pushing me deeper into its grasp. I wasn't fleeing the swamp. I had been walking right into its heart the entire time. The fog swirled around me like a cloak, and I could no longer tell where I had come from or where I was going. The landscape had become a maze of distorted trees, shifting shadows, and water that seemed to reach toward me, urging me closer. It was all wrong. I looked down at my hands, fingers trembling, and the sight of them only made the horror more real. The very skin of my hands seemed to melt away, twisting into something foreign, like I wasn't even myself. I was being reshaped, warped by the shadow's influence, its power growing stronger with each passing second. I was losing myself. A voice echoed in my mind, low and raspy, like the whisper of wind through dead branches. You have always been mine. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but the words grew louder, more insistent, until I could feel them inside my skull. The shadow was inside me. It had always been inside me, pulling at the edges of my mind, twisting my thoughts, my memories. I had thought I was in control, that I could fight it, but I had never truly stood a chance. The swamp had been calling me long before I ever set foot in it. It had followed me, waited for me. And now, it was ready to claim me entirely. The water, dark and still, rippled as though something was moving beneath it. I looked down and saw my reflection staring back at me, only it wasn't my face. The eyes that looked up at me were cold, hollow, blackened. They were the eyes of the shadow, the darkness that had consumed me. I wasn't myself anymore. I had become a part of it. I staggered backward, but the ground beneath me seemed to twist. The trees groaned, their bark splitting open, and the sound was deafening, like the world itself was tearing apart. The swamp was no longer just a place. It was alive, a sentient being that could feel, that could manipulate every part of me. And then I saw it, felt it, the shadow standing before me. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It had taken form. It was a twisted, fluid being that writhed like liquid, its body shifting and changing, undulating in ways that defied nature. Its presence filled every inch of the swamp, wrapping around me, suffocating me, until I could no longer tell where I ended and it began. The voice again, so close, so familiar, you thought you could escape me. You thought you could leave, but you've always belonged to me. You've always been mine. I screamed, or at least I tried to, but the sound was strangled, drowned out by the laughter that echoed all around me, from the trees, from the water, from within my own mind. The shadow was inside me, guiding me, controlling me. My thoughts weren't my own anymore. The things I saw, the things I felt, they were all illusions, created by the shadow to keep me from realizing the truth. The truth was that I had never been in control. Not once. I had come to the swamp, searching for answers, trying to uncover its secrets, but I had been walking straight into its trap the entire time. The shadow had been shaping my every move, pushing me toward my doom. It had always been in control. I looked around, desperately searching for something that made sense, but everything was wrong. The trees bent in impossible angles. The water shimmered, almost alive, reaching for me like a living thing. The sky above had turned an unnatural shade of red, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. The swamp had already claimed me, and now there was no escape from the shadow, no escape from the darkness inside me. The last remnants of my consciousness flickered like a dying flame, and as I fell to my knees, I realized with sickening certainty that there was nothing left of the person I once was. The shadow had won, and I was its final prisoner. There was no fight left in me. I had fought the swamp, fought the shadow, fought the creeping dread that had consumed my every waking thought. But now, standing here, shrouded in the thick, suffocating fog, I could feel it, the cold certainty that it was over. The final moment had arrived, and there was nothing left to do but wait. I had stopped running, stopped searching for an escape. The swamp, the shadow, it had me. It had claimed me long ago, and now I was just a prisoner in its dark, twisted realm. The edges of my vision blurred, like a dream fading at the moment of waking, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I welcomed it. There was no use in struggling anymore. The fight had drained me of everything I had, my hope, my will, my very sense of self. The air around me was thick with moisture, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Every breath I took felt like it was pulled from the swamp itself, as though the very air I inhaled was laced with its dark power. The trees loomed above me like silent, watching sentinels, their twisted limbs reaching out as if to hold me in place. The water, still and dark, seemed to whisper in the distance, calling me closer, beckoning me toward the place where the shadows ruled, where my fate had already been sealed. I had heard the whispers before, the voice of the swamp, the voice of the shadow, but now they were no longer separate. They had merged, become one, a single, overpowering force that had seeped into my very mind. I could hear even now, pulsing through my thoughts, a steady hum of dark promises, reminding me of my place in this eternal, cursed cycle. You belong here, it said. You always have. The swamp has claimed you. The shadow has always been inside you, and now you are part of it. I closed my eyes, but it didn't matter. The shadow was inside me, in my blood, in my bones. There was no escaping it. There was no one to help me, no one who could hear my cries, no one who could save me from the inevitable end. I tried to recall who I was before all of this, before the swamp, before the shadow, before the madness that had swallowed my life whole, but it felt like trying to remember a distant dream. I could almost see my old self, a person who once had hope, once believed in something beyond the darkness. But that person was gone now, replaced by something else. Something darker. Something that belonged to the swamp. The footsteps behind me, the ones I had heard in the dark, the ones I had thought were the product of my fear, were real. I had known they were real from the start. The shadow had been following me, guiding me, pushing me toward this final moment. And now, it was here. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel it, standing behind me, the presence that had haunted me for so long, finally closing in. It was no longer a whisper, no longer a shadow in the water or a flicker in the corner of my vision. It was here. It was real. I had accepted it. The shadow wasn't just an entity of the swamp, it was the swamp itself. And now, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I felt its cold touch at my shoulder, icy and suffocating, and I didn't flinch. There was nothing left in me to fight. The end was here. The shadow was here. My body went numb, my mind slipping further into the fog that clouded everything around me. There was no past, no future, only the present. Only the shadow. Only the swamp. And as I finally allowed myself to surrender to it, I understood. The swamp had always been my fate. The shadow had always been waiting. And now, I was nothing more than another part of it, lost in the endless dark that stretched far beyond the edge of this cursed land. I let go. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I was nothing. And then, everything went dark. I felt it before I saw it, the air growing heavier, thicker with an unnatural chill, the weight of something ancient and alive pressing down on me. The swamp around me seemed to shift, as though it, too, was holding its breath, waiting. And then, slowly, the world around me began to dissolve. I had been expecting this. Deep down, I had known that this moment would come, that the shadow would reveal itself fully. It had whispered its promises, taunted me with glimpses of its true form, but I hadn't wanted to believe it. I wanted to think that somehow, some way, I could escape, could outrun what had already marked me for its own. But as the air grew still and the fog thickened, I knew there was no running anymore. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, shifting as if it had been remade by the presence of the shadow. I could feel the earth trembling, the water in the swamp rippling with a slow, deliberate pulse, as though it was responding to something far deeper than the surface of the world. The trees around me creaked, their twisted limbs shaking as if they, too, were afraid of what was coming. And then it emerged. At first, it was just a flicker, a distortion in the air, a flicker of something dark and formless at the edge of my vision. But it grew. Slowly. Inexorably. The shadows that had once seemed like fleeting movements in the corners of my eyes coalesced into a mass, swirling, shifting. It was like watching ink spill into water, a darkness that expanded, pulsed, and grew, consuming everything it touched. It was no longer a shape, no longer a shadow in the traditional sense. It was something alive, something far older and more dangerous than anything I had ever imagined. A dark, fluid mass that stretched and writhed, an impossible presence that could not be contained by the laws of nature. It wasn't just an entity, it was the embodiment of the swamp itself, a curse that had been waiting for the right moment to rise and claim what was always destined to be its own. The air thickened as it moved, and I could feel it wrapping around me like a suffocating embrace. The world was slowly being swallowed whole, piece by piece, by this thing, this manifestation of the swamp's will. The trees around me twisted and groaned, their roots tearing from the ground as if the very earth itself was being consumed by this monstrous force. The water, once still and quiet, began to churn violently, blackened waves crashing against the shore, splashing over the land as the shadows spread further. I could feel its presence deep inside me, seeping into my bones, crawling under my skin. It wasn't just outside me. It was inside, reshaping me, twisting me into something unrecognizable, something that no longer belonged to the world of light. I tried to move, to step back, but my legs refused to obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot as the shadow stretched out, enveloping everything in its path. My vision darkened as it drew closer, and I could hear the sound of the swamp itself, its whispers, its calls, its heartbeat amplified like a distant thunderstorm. The shadow's form grew more distinct, though still formless, a swirling black mass that seemed to absorb the very light around it. There was no shape to it, no human form or creature to identify. It was pure darkness, fluid and alive, an endless void that pressed against every inch of the world I once knew. And in its depths, I could feel the curse, the swamp's curse, that had drawn me here, and marked me, had been waiting for me. The shadow was more than a thing. It was the swamp, alive with malice and hunger. It was the curse of this land, the weight of centuries of death, decay, and forgotten souls. It was everything that had been lost to the swamp, everything that had been dragged beneath the surface, forgotten in the dark corners of the water. It was pulling me in, inch by inch, dragging me toward its center, where the darkness was absolute, where nothing could escape. I was no longer just a victim. I was part of it now. The shadow, the swamp, they were one and the same. There was no distinction. And as the mass of blackness surrounded me, consuming every last vestige of light, I realized the truth. I had never stood a chance. I was never meant to. The shadow was not just here to claim me. It was here to make me a part of its curse. Forever. The darkness swallowed me whole. There was no moment of transition, no gradual slide into the void. 1 second, I was standing, struggling to comprehend the shadow's true form, and the next, everything was gone. The ground beneath my feet vanished, the air evaporated, and I was weightless, adrift in an endless sea of black. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever felt. There was no pain, no terror, just an overwhelming, all-encompassing silence. The world I once knew, the swamp, the trees, the water, even the shadow itself, ceased to exist. It was as if I had fallen off the edge of reality into a space where time and matter no longer held meaning. The shadow wrapped around me, not as a presence, but as an absence. It was the void, the absence of light, of life. It seeped into me, crawling through my veins like oil, drowning my thoughts, my very essence. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking, but there was no sense of up or down. There was only the shadow, only the sensation of being pulled deeper into something larger than myself. It didn't feel like death. It felt like erasure. I thought of my life, of the moments that had led me here, the quiet mornings in the village, the sound of the water lapping at the shore, the first time I saw the shadow. I thought of the people I had known, the faces that had slowly faded from my memory. But even those thoughts felt distant, like echoes of a dream, growing weaker and more fragmented with every passing second. I could feel myself stretching, my body becoming part of the dark mass that surrounded me, merging with the swamp itself. It was as though I had always been meant to be here, always meant to be consumed. The shadow didn't just claim my life. It claimed everything I had ever been. The more I sank into it, the more my identity, my memories, began to dissolve into the depths of the water. My fingers no longer moved as my own, my thoughts no longer seemed to come from me. The water rushed in, cold and dark, filling my lungs, drowning me from the inside out. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the deep silence that pressed in from all sides. I couldn't feel my arms, my legs, or even the beating of my heart. I was dissolving, fragmenting into pieces that drifted away, carried by the pull of the swamp, the force of the shadow's grip. It wasn't the suffocation of drowning, it wasn't the burning sensation of panic, it was the slow, inevitable fading of everything I had ever been. A final thought flashed through my mind, a whisper of something I had once been, a part of me that still clung to the surface. Was I ever more than this? But the thought was fleeting, like the last ripple in the water before it disappeared entirely. My body, my mind, my very soul, everything was being absorbed by the swamp, by the shadow, by the thing that had been waiting for me all along. The water closed over me, pulling me under. There was no light, no sound, no escape. And then there was nothing. As the shadow consumed me, I felt something stir deep within, something that shouldn't have been possible. It was a fleeting thought, as fragile and broken as the last breath of a dying man. In the blackness, where there was no light and no sound, I wondered, did I ever have a chance? Could I have truly escaped? The terror that had once clawed at my mind, threatening to tear me apart, now felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. But then, the realization hit me with a force that shook the very core of my being. I was never meant to escape. It was a truth I could feel, even though I no longer had the capacity to think clearly. The shadow, the water, the swamp, they weren't simply a threat. They were a part of something older, something inevitable. They had been here long before I was born, and they would remain long after I was gone. The terror that had plagued me, the fear that drove me to search for answers, was merely a part of the design. A design that I was never meant to survive. I thought of all the people who had vanished before me. The ones the locals whispered about, the ones whose names were lost to time, swallowed by the very waters that had claimed me. They hadn't escaped either. They were a part of the curse. A part of the shadow. I had fought. I had struggled, clinging to every shred of hope, every rational thought. I had convinced myself that I could outsmart it, that I could survive it. But in the end, I was nothing more than a pawn. The shadow wasn't just an entity, it was the swamp itself, an unstoppable force of nature, an ancient presence that could not be defied. I had never stood a chance. The last moments of my life were filled with a crushing weight, a suffocating sensation that grew heavier with each passing second. My memories, my life, were fading. They were dissolving into the dark abyss, pulled into the depths of the swamp where nothing could reach them. It was as though my very identity was being erased, as though I had never existed at all. I wanted to scream, to claw my way back to the surface, but there was no surface anymore. There was no escape. I realized then, in that final, horrible moment, that I had been drawn here for a reason. The shadow had been waiting for me, as it had waited for so many others before me. It wasn't just a monster, a myth, or a curse. It was the essence of the swamp itself, an ancient force that devoured those who dared to trespass, those who thought they could conquer it. And now, I was part of it. As the darkness wrapped around me, as the water pulled me deeper, I felt the terror of everything I had ever known slip away. The fear that had once consumed me was now a distant echo, and in its place, there was nothing. No hope. No salvation. Only the shadow. It wasn't just my body that was being taken. It was my soul. In the end, the shadow had won. And I was lost to it, forever. When it was over, there was only silence. The shadow, that consuming darkness that had once surrounded me, receded. Slowly, as if it had never been there to begin with. The weight, the suffocating grip of its presence, faded into the distance, leaving behind a quiet stillness. I could no longer feel its cold fingers creeping along my skin, no longer sense its relentless pull. But I was no longer whole. I could no longer understand what remained of me. My thoughts felt fragmented, scattered like broken pieces of glass in a sea of nothing. I wasn't sure if I was still part of the world, or if I had already crossed over, trapped in some other place where time and memory didn't exist. What was left of me? My body, my soul, were they still mine? When the shadow retreated, it left behind only the remnants of my life, the things that once defined me. My boots, muddy and caked with the earth of the swamp, were discarded near the edge of the water. My jacket, torn from the struggles, lay abandoned on the damp ground, its once vibrant fabric now faded and stained. A small pocket knife, once carried in my hand as a tool for survival, glinted in the dim light, its blade dulled by time and use. These objects, these fragments of my existence, seemed so insignificant now, as though they were nothing more than relics of a past life. Yet they were all that remained, a cruel reminder of the person I had been. The shadow had taken it all, the essence of who I was, and left behind only the physical remnants. The swamp had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of stagnant water. The silence felt endless, as if the world was holding its breath. But it wasn't empty. It was waiting. The swamp, ever patient, had grown accustomed to this cycle, to the endless parade of souls that wandered too close, that dared to uncover its secrets. And now, it waited for the next one. A low, eerie breeze stirred the branches of the trees, but there was no sound from the water. No ripples, no movement. It was as if the swamp itself was holding its breath, preparing for the next victim to wander into its embrace. The dark waters lapped quietly at the shore, an uninviting, beckoning call to anyone who might listen. The legend was never wrong. The swamp would always claim its own. It was a cycle that would never end. The shadow was already gone, but the swamp would wait. It always did. And somewhere, out there, someone would hear its call. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.